Chairman Kinski, you're all set.
Okay, thank you. I will call to order this two-day meeting of the Select Committee on School Finance Recalibration. And I would ask Josh or Matt to please call the roll.
Senator Bebout.
Here.
Senator Coe.
Here.
Senator Hicks.
Excused.
He's there.
Here.
Oh, he's here.
Senator Cost.
Here.
Senator Rothfuss.
Here.
Representative Barlow.
Present.
Representative Connolly.
Here.
Representative Harshman.
Excused.
Representative Nicholas.
Here.
Representative Schwartz.
Here.
Co-Chairman Summers.
Here.
And Co-Chairman Kinski.
Here.
And we
I
have
would
a
also
quorum.
note and extend it. Pardon?
I just said we have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. I would also extend a welcome to members of the Joint Education Interim Committee who are joining us here today to receive the first draft of the recalibration report. The first order of business is opening comments. And rather than my comment, any comment from me, I'm going to defer to the senior member of this body, Senator Coe, to offer comment. After that will be Representative Co-Chair Summers, and then we will approve the minutes and get into the day's business. Senator Coe, opening comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was actually figuring it out this morning, and this is my fifth recalibration. Started in 05, and I've been working with Dr. Pikus and Dr. Auden, who I see Dr. Auden there, in 05. But we find ourselves, I think, in a difficult situation this time, a more difficult situation. We're looking straight down the barrel of a $510 million educational deficit shortfall for 23-24, and this is coupled with a $300 to $500 million biennium general fund shortfall. So what I would hope we would do is realize that we have to be responsible. And I would hope that we would make responsible reductions if we make reductions, which I would support. End up with a model that we can afford while still protecting teachers in the classroom. Out there somewhere, we're probably going to have to talk revenue enhancement or taxes. But I just don't think we've quite reached that point yet until we come up with a model, an evidence-based model that is adequate. And I'm going to emphasize again, adequate, because that's what the Supreme Court decision said, that the legislature has the option to fund K-12 education adequately, but that it must be cost-based. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that kind of concludes my remarks. 510 million, I'll say again in 23-24, and projections in the next biennium after that really go south, because that's when the local ad valorem assessed valuations kick in. They run a year behind. That could be up to $1 billion. So we've got a tough job, and this is going to be a tough lift. And I have a lot of confidence in Dr. Auden and Dr. Pikus. I've been working with them for a long time. Not only that, they're good friends. And I see Larry Pikus is on now. I see he's in the Tetons. He's over in Jackson, which is a good place for him. So, but anyway, Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me make some remarks, and I'd stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Senator Coe took my comments as co-chair. I'll now turn to my co-chairman, Representative Summers, for any opening comments.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Chairman Coe, Senator Coe, I want to first of all thank you for your years and years of service to this state and to education. I think you have been stalwart, in the legislature for many, many years. And so my first thing is to thank you for your service. And then I want to thank all the educators out there that are listening or tuned in, and for their service to children in the state of Wyoming. And then how we move forward will affect education in Wyoming and affect kids in Wyoming. It could anyway. And so I want to, the numbers we're going to banter around, I'm going to say that I think that the $500 and some million deficit in education is actually 21, 22, and it moves out to over 800 million in 23, 24. And actually the general fund deficit is twice that of the education deficit right now. So we do face a troubling time. Having said that, we also have a constitutional responsibility to education, which is why we bring in Mr. Oden and Mr. Pikus. And they will help provide us a model that will provide an adequate, equitable education. And then from there, we will make a decision as a legislature whether we follow that or cut from that or add to that. That's how we've always done it. But it's really these two gentlemen and their cohorts' responsibility to provide us that, I would call it a constitutional model. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will turn it back to you and thank you very much.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Co-Chairman Summers. The next item of business
Mr.
is
Chairman.
the reading and
Yeah, Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
please.
Just one thing to add, and I totally agree with Representative Summers in looking at all the hard work that Senator Coe has done and will continue to do as we do recal through this late summer, I guess early winter, and into the fall. The one thing I would add, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, is that before there was recalibration in the mid-90s after Campbell won, for good, bad, or indifference, I was on that committee that looked at what we do with education. And back then, I never really realized or thought we'd get to the point where we would have all the discussion about a cost-based model, although I realized what the Supreme Court said. And we did in the late 90s, we didn't have nearly the discussion that we're having now and the complication and all the different things in recal. So I bring a different perspective to this recal based on what we thought originally, what we did originally, and now we are where we are. And it's been quite a journey. I never thought we'd have 37 or however how many components there are in the model. And so it's got it's a lot more complicated today. And I'm not sure that the difference is totally what we look for and what we expected or what we wanted when we started after Campbell won. But here we are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Bebout. With that, the next order of business is the approval of the minutes of our June 24 to 25 meeting. Is there a motion to approve or to amend those minutes?
Move to approve.
It's been moved by Senator Cost. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by raising your hands to your cameras. All right, that motion passes. The minutes are approved. We will now move on into the agenda. The first item scheduled for 8:40 is introductions of Dr. Pikus, Auden, and Dr. Schloman and Dr. Hoyer. So I'll turn it over to either Dr. Pikus or Dr. Auden to take it away.
Mr. Co-Chair, this is Representative
Yes.
Summers. Could I ask a process question just for the committee?
Please.
As we move through this, obviously this is segmented into segments as we go down through the agenda. I'm assuming that, how will you like us to ask questions at the end of those segments? What's your preference on questions from the committee?
Well, I'll tell you, this is just me speaking, but we've got a large group of people here. In addition to recal, we've got education. I would hope that at the end of each of the segments, and by that I'm referring to Topic 3, overview, as being a segment. Topic 4, instructional resources, as being a segment. That questions from the committee would come after each of those rather than after each element. But that's just a preference. If anybody's wanting to comment or interrupt with a question, I'm going to recognize them. And I do also thank you for that, Representative Summers. I want to make note that we have public comment scheduled at 11:30, as well as at 4:45, and then extensive public comment scheduled for tomorrow. We have received requests for comment, and those that have submitted requests have outlined which topic they'd like to comment on. So they will be slotted into the appropriate public comment period following the coverage of that particular topic. So I don't know that I answered your question, Representative Summers. All I can do as chair is express a preference, but I'm going to recognize anybody that that wants to speak or ask a question at any point in the proceedings.
Mr.
With
Chairman.
that, Dr. Pikus or Dr. Odden, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. On behalf of Pikus Odden and Associates and the team of people we have here today, I want to thank you for the opportunity to meet with you for the next 2 days and discuss the current recalibration model that we have developed for you. What I think I should do to start is share my screen. I believe I have the ability to do so. Host is disabled, attendee screen sharing. So I will share my screen with our PowerPoints as soon as somebody makes that possible. In the meantime, why don't I start with the part that's probably pretty straightforward, which is introductions. There are 4 of us here today who are will be making the presentation. The bulk of it will be myself, Larry Pikus, as well as my colleague Alan Odden, who those of you who've been through recalibrations, Senator Coe said 5 of them. This is our 4th one. So we missed one along the way. We've gotten to know many of you very, very well and look forward to working with you. In addition, I have 2 other people with me. So let me just start and then I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly as well. I'm Larry Pikus. I'm one of the 2 principals of Pikus Odden and Associates. I've had the privilege of working on projects in Wyoming, mostly all related to school finance, since sometime around the year 1999 or 2000. I did some work with the previous consultant and testified in the Campbell 2 case on behalf of the state. I've led the 2005, 2010, 2015, and now the 2020 recalibrations with Alan. And we've been working so far this year. Look forward to continuing the process with all of you. It's always a privilege to be here. In my day job, if you will, I am a professor of education, finance, and policy at the USC Rossier School of Education, where I also serve as the Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Affairs. Let me indicate each of the other 3 people who will say something. Then I'll have them each speak in order as well, if that's okay, Mr. Chair. Alan Odden, who's co-principal of our firm. In addition, today we have with us Don Schloman, who is the principal in District Leadership Solutions and has worked with us on a number of the items in the recalibration, as well as Kathleen Mulvaney Hoyer, who is works with Activate Research. And Activate Research has worked with us carefully in our case studies and our professional judgment panels, which I'll explain in more detail as we move into the presentation. So Alan, and then Don, and then Kathleen. How's that?
Thank you. Just a couple of comments. I too am happy to be here today. I think I'm happy, maybe everybody's happy that the meetings today and tomorrow are virtual. The weather report in our paper said that it was snowing and 31 in Cheyenne. So I'm sort of glad to be back here in Florida where it's 95. In addition to working with Larry for the past 20 years in various states as well as Wyoming, I retired in 2013 from the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a professor of education policy and school finance. Kathleen.
Actually, I think we were going to have Don speak next.
Oh, okay.
Good morning. I'm Don Schloman. I'm the founding partner of an organization called District Leadership Solutions. We're a group of what I would like to refer to ourselves as seasoned ex-superintendents, retired superintendents, And we work with school districts that have diminishing resources, which there are a lot of those around the country right now. 15 years as a superintendent, 10 years as a business official prior to that. And it was exciting to work on this project. I just wish we could have spent more time in the state with officials, the officials, but the cooperation that we've got along the way from your education partners and from the legislature and the LSO has just been phenomenal. And so I thank you very much and looking forward to today's discussion.
Kathleen.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Kathleen Mulvaney Hoyer. As Larry mentioned, I work at a company called Activate Research. We are a small women-owned social science research firm based out of Washington, D.C. And as Larry said, we've been helping out with the professional judgment panels and the case studies. And when I weigh in today and in other meetings, I will probably be weighing more in on the case studies. So of course, I'd be happy to speak on either piece. As Larry said, I've had the honor to work with he and Alan on school finance projects here in Wyoming with this project, as well as in Vermont and Maryland. And I've also done some other school finance and teacher policy work. Again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I see that I had authority to share my screen and I've done so. So I hope that you have all are able to see it now. And I've left PowerPoint sort of the work mode rather than the display mode. It enables us to jump around much more quickly if we want to look at different things. Also, the nature of my two monitor system here, it doesn't work very well and I can't see all of you if I have it working on that and I haven't quite figured out how to fix that. So I apologize for that mode, but I think it should work just fine and should cover most of your screen. I'd like to start, if I may, with a brief agenda. We've done the introductions. We want to then jump right into a review of the evidence-based model in Wyoming. Alan will provide an overview of the model. I think we went through that to some extent the last time we met with you in June. We wanted to give you a reminder of it, and then we'll provide a detailed discussion of the elements. Alan and I will work back and forth in presenting those, and we'll see how it all works. We're used to sitting next to each other, and it's very clear to each of us who should say something or when we want to. One of us wants to jump in. It's a little trickier when we're about 3,000 miles apart. It's not snowing here. It's really warm, but it's we're sitting here. So we will do our best to keep track of things and move forward. And I think we should be able to. We were quite successful in that in June, and I think it'll work out just fine. We obviously want to seek feedback from the committee, discuss next steps, and then sometime tomorrow, we'll wrap this up. A final discussion. We obviously follow the lead of the committee on the schedule and all of those things as we proceed forward. We've done the introductions, so I want us to talk about the evidence-based model, and I'm going to leave it to Alan to start that conversation. And I'm going to try to flip the slides, but he'll warn me when he'd like me to change a slide as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alan.
Okay, thank you, Larry and Mr. Co-Chair and members of the committee. The recalibration project this year had several elements. One was a complete review of the components, all the elements in the current block grant model, as well as some elements that are not in the block grant model. Pretty much all elements that comprise the school funding, K-12 school funding in Wyoming. Secondly, as Kathleen has said, case studies of improving schools in Wyoming. We also
Unknown caller.
Sorry about that. There's also one case of a high-performing school that also has a high percentage of at-risk students to give us additional information on how schools improve and how schools produce high levels of performance in the state of Wyoming. We had in June and July 18 professional judgment panels, which were very, very helpful. And I've forgotten the number of people that we talked with, but we talked to almost close to 200 people, teachers, a variety of other kinds of staff, as well as board members and superintendents and other central office staff. to give us additional information. And we've tried to summarize in the report the input that we received on each of the elements from the panels. There's a separate and extensive study of special education, how special education services are provided in Wyoming. That report will be presented at the October meeting. And I think the focus of that report is, what's good for kids? That is, what are the best strategies to provide services to students with disability, and what do they cost, and are some strategies both more effective as well as more cost effective than others. And then also in October, there will be the presentation of the findings from the case studies. And then finally, after all of those individual studies have been presented with feedback from the committee, we will prepare a final report with all of those elements. Next slide. Larry, next slide. Larry, you're on, okay. The EB approach, the goal of the EB approach is to estimate the resources needed to provide all students an equal opportunity to meet the state proficiency standards, as well as the cost of those resources. And one of the things that we would argue is the EB model is targeted on providing the resources needed to deliver the basket and to provide large improvements in student performance to the basket. Larry will say more about this later, but the goal of the EB model is really to provide a set of resources so that all schools and districts could have as a goal, a medium to long-term goal, having 80 to 90% of their students performing at or above the proficiency level. The EB model draws data and information from three sources. One is current education research on each of the individual elements themselves. The secondly is studies of schools and districts that have actually produced large improvements in student performance. And that's why we were doing the case studies in Wyoming. And then third, input from educator review panels in this case in Wyoming, but in any state we worked in, to tailor whatever the core recommendations are of the EB model to specifics in a particular state. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. This is an overview of the school improvement model that is sort of intertwined with all of the different elements. And when we've studied schools and districts that have really improved student performance, this is how they've done it. And I'll try to be quick here, but one can see where the various elements that are independent and individualistic fit into an overall school improvement strategy. And I'm going to present it sort of in a sequential way, although many schools and districts can start at any one of these bullet areas and over time implement them all. Point number one is they analyze student performance data, particularly at the school level. They start with the data from the state summative assessments, which would be YTOP in Wyoming. But then they also include what are called short cycle assessments over time that they use to analyze the effectiveness of their curriculum instruction strategies, the effectiveness of any interventions for students. Oftentimes they have common end of curriculum unit assessments that all teachers in the school or all teachers in the district use, and then they get together and talk about how all the kids did in a particular area on that common test. From that analysis, generally schools set ambitious goals. And again, one ambitious goal would be all or nearly all students performing at or above proficiency. Third, they review evidence of good instruction and effective curriculum. So that, and oftentimes when the standards have been redone uh, uh, that becomes the time when faculties and districts go back to the drawing board and look around for a more effective curriculum program, as well as over time compile evidence of the instructional strategies that are effective in delivering that curriculum. And in schools that really move the student achievement needle, once they've identified these effective instructional strategies, they become part of ongoing professional development. And the sense at the school is that all teachers should be implementing these instructional strategies so that instruction is not individualistic to each teacher, but is more common and cohesive across the school and a set of pedagogical activities in the classrooms and strategies that all teachers are implementing. Third, there's a lot of investment in ongoing professional development, including instructional coaches. So teachers would meet often during the week, not just once, but multiple times during the week. If they had access to instructional coaches, with instructional coaches, they'd be analyzing student performance data to figure out what kids knew and didn't know, where their instructional strategies were effective and not. And this is ongoing, so it's job embedded, so that a lot of the professional development happens in these professional learning communities as these groups of teachers are working out how to teach a particular curriculum unit and what the set of instructional strategies are that they would use. Fifth point is, no matter how good the first round of instruction is, there's going to be schools that, or students that will struggle to meet the high standards. And so schools that are really moving the needle and reducing achievement gaps have a variety of extra help strategies for students. And that's where, for the EB model, the tutors come in place, both the core tutors and the tutors that are triggered by at-risk student counts. That's where extended day and summer school programming comes into place. And Kathleen might want to add here what we've been finding in Wyoming that even adds to the extra help that interventionist tutor can provide.
Yes, thank you. So I think one thing I'd like to say about all 10 of the points is that we looked very carefully to study whether or not or how the high performing and improving schools in Wyoming implemented these types of strategies and how they did so and how they used their resources to do so. Everything that we're still analyzing the data, we're still looking through what we have found. And so everything that I can say over these next couple of days, I really think I need to stress is very preliminary because we're still learning, we're still making sense of all of our findings. But one thing that I think might be very helpful to note is that we've been learning this extra help for struggling students really takes on many different forms. And what we found in a lot of the Wyoming schools is that sometimes you might think of this as extra help for struggling students. Another way to think of this, and another thing that we're seeing in your schools, is providing extra help on specific skills, sometimes for many students in the school, sometimes for all students. You know, maybe students don't need a targeted intervention, a full intervention package. Maybe they don't need sustained intervention for several months, but maybe they need some extra help with particular skills. And schools that have been able to leverage their resources to provide targeted support to students in these ways seem to have had some success in these areas.
Thank you. That kind of leads to the next point here, restructure the school day. And many of the schools have what in Wyoming is whatever I need, which is a win period. Other schools call it an intervention period. And these are times during the day at both elementary, middle, and high school levels where all kids get some kind of extra help, whether it's practicing skills enrichment or whether it's extra help for struggling students. And during these times, it's all hands on deck. So it's not just the interventionist teachers, but it's all the teachers in schools working with a variety of students. Next point is strong leadership for database decision-making. This is leadership at the teacher level in PLCs. This is principal support for professional learning communities. This is district support for what the principals need. to schedule time so that teachers can work in these professional learning communities, and to make data and student performance available to the school and to teachers. Finally, effective schools don't do it themselves. These are not schools that pick themselves up by their own bootstraps. They reach out to the professional community, the broader professional community, for information on research that might help them. They might benchmark themselves to another school district or school in a similar context that have moved the student achievement needle. And they try to kind of do as much as they can to bring the information and knowledge outside their school into the school so they can be more effective. And the last point is that talent matters. And that is that these schools are very conscious about trying to find places to recruit and then to retain high quality teachers. And they're very conscious about this. They're very careful about it. When they find a good teacher, they provide a lot of training and a lot of support within the school. So they pay a lot of attention to getting the teachers and principals that are needed to move the student achievement needle. Next slide. The EB model can be kind of viewed as a set of 5 buckets, and we're going to sort of go through this, the details of each one of these buckets as we kind of go to the elements and categories of elements. There's staffing for core programs. That's in the upper left hand. That's the gold box. Then there's dollar per pupil resources, such as dollar per pupil for computers, dollars per pupil for books and instruction materials. The purple box is extra resources for struggling students, whether it's the at-risk tutors or all the way up to special education. The green box is central office functions, operation and maintenance, central office, transportation, et cetera. And then Wyoming specific factors, which would be salaries and other issues like that. Next slide. Because the EB model uses the response to intervention approach, we've sort of made it this triangle that reflects the response to innovation. So all the elements down at the bottom in gold are tier 1 instruction. That tier 1 would also include the brown, because that's also part of the tier 1 instruction. Then as you kind of go up to the top, the summer school of tutors, that's tier 2. That's the first set of strategies for students that need a little bit of extra help. And all of that then is done before a student who's still struggling and can't make it is identified as a student with a specific learning disability, and then given an individual education program and put into a special education program. So I think I'm not going to go through all the elements here, but to say that this is where all the elements fit into that 5 buckets of the Wyoming evidence-based model. Next slide, Larry. Also, as we go through summarizing the allocations for each of the elements, many times we refer to prototypical schools. And you can interpret this differently for different elements, but the prototypical schools were specifically created for Wyoming. They are a little smaller than Larry and I have used in other states. And they sort of came out of what the funding model was in the early 2000s. And so at the elementary level, the notion here is the prototypical school would have 288 students, and that would be 48 students in each grade, K to 5. That would be called a 3-section school. So there'd be 3 kindergarten classes, 3 first grade classes, et cetera. Sometimes the recommendation is that an elementary school would get one thing for each prototypical school. For example, a principal. Each prototypical school gets a principal. Sometimes that element, like a principal, is maintained all the way down to some level. And for elementary schools, a school all the way down to 96 students, which would be a one-section elementary school, would get a full principal. And then below that, they receive assistant principals. Sometimes the element is can be viewed as, you know, one of the elements for every 288 students. So every elementary school in the EB model is allocated a core counselor, and every prototypical elementary school is allocated a core tutor. But another way to think about that is at the elementary level, for every 288 students, they are allocated a core counselor and a core tutor. And of course, if the numbers are lower, then they would get a portion of a tutor and a counselor. And if the numbers are higher, then they would get more than one. The same notion there is for the middle school and the high school. The prototypical size for the middle school is 315. I think that is 5 classes of 21 students, drawing from the or from the legislative model. In the high school, in most cases, the prototypical size of the high school is 630, but in some cases, it would be allocated, you know, one element for every 315 students. And these prototypical schools are both used as heuristic ways to try to understand what a particular formula or for a particular element would produce in terms of a real school. And now I think Larry is going to make a few other comments before we get into element 1, which is full day kindergarten.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I want to make a couple of comments here. Then I think if I understood your comments at the beginning, you wanted to stop for questions before we started into the next section. So the first one I want to talk about, Alan mentioned early in his comments that the evidence-based model is designed to provide an adequate level of resources so that between 80 and 90% of all students in the state and in every district should be able to meet the state's proficiency standards or above. We have done a fairly quick analysis of that for the report. It doesn't appear on our PowerPoints, but it appears on page 11 and 12 of the report itself, where we looked at the YTOP scores, and we also looked at how the state performs on the NAEP. And I think what those tables show is that statewide, the performance in all subject areas on the YTOP on page 11 are below that 80% goal. In fact, the only one that even reaches a level of 60% proficient and above in the YTOP at the present time is English Language Arts for the 6th grade. So the YTOP ideally is designed to meet the specific expectations of students within the state of Wyoming, and this suggests that there's room to continue to grow and improve student performance. What I would say is we've worked with Wyoming educators throughout the state to talk to them in our professional judgment panels and case studies. All of them share that goal of moving that number much higher than it is. So one would hope that with the resources and their dedication, you'll see improvements as time moves forward.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, I'm unclear as to whether you want to address
Senator Rothfuss. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a question about the 60%, and you provided data on where we're at with regard to meeting those expectations. We just set those cut scores a few years ago, obviously, as we developed YTOP, and it was a professional judgment panel that worked with our psychometrician to figure out where the cut scores would be. So there are some implications, I think, in the document that suggest that we're underperforming because we're not achieving a higher number on that. But I was just curious what your thoughts are. We basically set the numbers. We could have had 90% proficiency if we just set the number at 90% proficiency. So I want to make sure that you're comfortable with where we're starting now as being like a rational starting point to still achieve the 90% proficiency based on where we set those cut scores.
Doctor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Senator Rothfuss. Alan may jump in as I answer this as well. So we'll see where we go. I think that we recognize that the YTOP is a new assessment, that there's always sort of a pattern of changes in proficiencies as you set new scores and new tests. What I would say is I'm not sure I'm qualified to make a judgment as to what the cut scores should be or should have been, or even, you know, my comfort level is this being a starting point. I think more what we would say is that the resources that we identify in the evidence-based model should be adequate, are adequate to enable schools to produce levels of 80% or above proficient and advanced in the short to medium term, say 3 to 5 years. Alan, I don't know if you want to add something to that or change that, but that's what I think. That's how I would answer the question.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Senator Rothfuss, I think I like Lear, we're not psychometricians, so we would defer to Wyoming in terms of setting the cut scores. I think the one thing I would say 2 or 3 things. Number one, NAEP is sort of like a benchmark for all states in terms of where they set their cut scores, because NAEP also has a basic, proficient, and advanced. And what it shows that in Wyoming, because the students are scoring, you know, somewhat higher on YTOP than NAEP, the cut score for proficient in Wyoming is probably a little less. I'm not trying to make a big deal of this, but a little less rigorous than NAEP. And secondly, that the EB model has always been sort of geared towards providing a set of resources that would allow all schools and students to make significant continuous progress towards performing at a proficient level on, I would say, first state assessments, because most of them tend to have their proficiency level a little bit less rigorous than NAEP, but also over time on NAEP. So I think the way we would see it is that the resources in the EB model would be sufficient for your schools and your students to continue to make significant progress towards achieving at or above the proficiency level.
And Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. Senator Cost and then Senator Bebout. I think Senator Cost has.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question for either one of you. If I'm understanding correctly, the cut scores are not static, but they're dynamic in year-to-year changes. I believe that's true of NAEP as well as the YTOP. How do we adjust for those changes all the time? Because it continually changes to where that middle score is in the middle of the group rather than allowing everybody to get to the top the way that it would be nice to say.
Mr. Chair,
Dr.
Mr. Chair, Senator Cost, I think as I understand it, the cut scores for YTOP have been set. Unless I misunderstand it, I don't think they're reset every year. The resetting came when Wyoming shifted from PAWS, which is the test that you used before YTOP. And so that when you shifted from that PAWS to YTOP, the state had to go through a process like any other state to reset the basic, proficient, and advanced levels. But I think once now that it's set, unless somebody can correct me, I think it's static as long as you continue to use that test. And there may be periodic changes in NAEP, but I also think that NAEP has tried to show how you can compare performance on NAEP over time to some consistent level of performance.
Thank you, Senator Bebout and then Representative Summers.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 questions. One is, you go back to your slide on page 6 where you talk about the evidence based approach. And you said to meet state proficiency standards. And the one word that, and Senator Coe mentioned early on in his opening comments, that I don't see in anything you said so far is adequacy. And as I look at the Supreme Court decision and some of the input and knowledge that I've had over all these years, adequacy was a big part of it. You don't even mention it. So that's the first question. The second question is, you talk about, so many principals per so many students, so many assistant principals. As a businessman, I develop and I understand oversight and G&A and costs. Where do you come up with those numbers? In a business, there's got to be a basis for that. Is it at 96 you can't control the kids? I don't understand where your basis is and the assumptions you make, and that would not work with most business models. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Doctor?
Go ahead, Larry.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, you want to do it, Alan, or you?
No, you.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Mr. Chair, Representative Bebo, I guess it doesn't actually specifically state adequacy in slide 6. I think that this is the evidence-based model of school finance adequacy. And so we've just perhaps assumed that throughout, that what we're measuring is adequacy, which is an adequate level of resources to achieve the standard that we've set there. The more important part of your question, I think, was how do we measure this? How do we get there? I think that's what we intend to spend the day doing. The way we approach understanding what resources and levels we need is the 3 steps that are actually listed on that slide, where we review current research. We look at how schools have improved student performance and what they've done to do it. And we talk to educator panels reviews. The idea being, if you were to design a school that would have a high probability of getting 80% or more of the students to proficient or advanced on your state's test, the YTOP, using the basket of educational goods and services providing that basket of educational goods and services that the legislature and the department have established, what resources would you need to have a reasonable expectation that could be done? And so by looking at research, by looking at what successful schools have done, we then estimate those levels of resources. In most instances, as you'll see as we go through this in the next couple of days, that has to do with personnel resources and the kinds of things in the work that they do. And then it has to do with dollar resources to purchase materials and supplies and other things that you actually use to purchase things. So that's how we would reach the measure of what we're going to do, or what the resources should be.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, one quick follow-up to all that, and I look forward to that discussion about your model and your assumptions and your professional versus the business model that I look at. I look forward to that. The other thing is, you just went over it very briefly, but I still think that there's a huge difference between meet state proficiency standards versus adequate. And that discussion will continue. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bebout. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of things, and I want to thank Senator Bebout, because it really goes to one of my first questions. And I think, as I've read your report, so I want to make sure this is clear. I look at page 5 at the top, and it says the intent of the Wyoming K-12 funding model is to identify the amounts necessary for the legislature to appropriate funding for the state's basket of educational goods and services, and then to provide each district with the adequate funds to provide the basket, providing each student an equal opportunity to meet Wyoming students' performance standards. And so my first question, and I'm going to go through a couple things, but I think my first question here is, the Wyoming K-12 funding model is in fact the model you're recommending, right? So they are one and the same. It's not what, this is not the legislative model. This model that you refer to on page 5 is the model that you all are creating. And so that's my first question. So, and then I want to shift over and just quickly on page 15 at the start of your chapter 3. It says, in all of our previous work, we relied on the EB model to estimate the personnel and dollar resources needed to enable each school district in the state to provide the educational program as described in state law. The educational program established following the initial Court Campbell ruling remained the same until 2018, when the legislature amended in, and you go on basically computer science. And so my first question, Mr. Chairman, and then I would have a follow-up question, is on page 5, the Wyoming K-12 funding model. That is in fact the EB model. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I think that the evidence-based model is the tool that we have used in each of the recalibrations to estimate the resources needed for adequacy. They're the resources that we would recommend in each legislative session following that. The actual choice of allocation of resources has been somewhat different than the evidence-based model, and then throughout our report, we make comparisons between our evidence-based model and the legislative model, which is what the legislature chose to appropriate. In 2005, when this first divergence occurred, the resources allocated by the legislature exceeded those of the evidence-based model. That is, there was spend more money than we said that the model needed to spend. I believe the term that Michael O'Donnell coined at that time was legislative grace. And certainly I've said at every recalibration that I've ever participated in here in Wyoming, our job is never to tell you to not spend more money on schools if you want to spend more than our model recommends. And we certainly would never say that now either. And so typically in the past, the legislative model has exceeded evidence-based model. At this point in time, we have not done the final costing out yet because we haven't added in the salaries. So I can't opine on whether or not the total cost of the evidence-based model is the same, less than, or more than the legislative model. The two are similar, but they're not identical. I hope that answers your questions, Representative Summers.
So Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't think I was clear. So go to page 5 of your report. And look at the top, and it says the intent of the Wyoming K-12 funding model. So tell me in this write-up what you're referring to as the Wyoming K-12 funding model.
If I might,
report,
Mr. Co-Chair and Representative Summers, I think that is the EB model. So I think the language here may be confusing, but the EB model is what we would recommend as the Wyoming funding model.
That was my point. And I think that was the point of what I wanted to state there is that you are costing out the basket of goods, and that is the Wyoming model. And so, Mr. Chairman, the one other question I have is really on page 1 of your, in chapter 1, page 1 of your report. And I think it goes to, maybe concerns of some of my fellows. And that is in the middle of the page, it says, the revenue declines have challenged the legislature. And by extension, our team of researchers have searched for the most cost-effective options to provide the elements of the basket of goods and services. So what that tells me is that you have looked for basically looked at cost-effective options, and that you will apply them as you create this model. Is that correct?
Mr. Representative Summers, that's correct. And I think that's our interpretation of what we have been supposedly doing for all the recalibration. We view the cost-based approach as identifying strategies and then picking the strategy. If there are two strategies that are equally as effective, then selecting the strategy which is the least costly. So for example, and I don't want to get into trouble at this right now, but in some cases, districts in Wyoming and other states provide special education services or services to English language learning students through a co-teaching model. That is, they'll have 2 teachers in the classroom. That kind of a strategy, if it's effective, is twice as effective as providing those services with a teacher who has a set of additional strategies, like we would argue, sheltered English instruction, and you don't need the second teacher in there. So when there have been choices, we will choose the most effective strategy that's also the least cost. And that's sort of our definition of cost-based.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, just a quick comment, and I know that you and I have been texting, but when we do the question period, I'm not smart enough to figure out how to see the full screen. And I don't know when we do each question section, if the person that's sharing their screen could minimize that share so we could kind of go back to the full view. It's hard to, maybe my good co-chair can keep track of everything, but it's hard for me to see. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We just finished up the overview of evidence-based model. We're in this section of questions from the committee. We're 15 minutes behind schedule. Are there further questions? Senator Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and I want to take up a little bit back on the reports. And when we go to table 1.1 and it shows the operating revenues, but right above that, it has a narrative there. And here's my question is, if we're looking at what the adequate funding is to get to that proficiency level, in the discussion right above that, it says that as shown in Chapter 2, data from the NAEPS suggest improvements in student performance have not grown at the same pace as the growth in revenues in education in Wyoming. So I don't know which gentleman would like to answer that question, but the question is, are the districts then not following? So why are we not attaining that level of proficiency, even though we've seen the money go up substantially? So are districts not following the model and implementation? Or I'm trying to understand the nexus as to what we spent a lot more money, but we're not getting the results. What's causing that? Is that individual school districts? Is there something in the model that's not performing? So I guess is it a model flaw, or is it a delivery flaw that's not getting us there? And just a question on that.
Doctor?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and in answer to the question, I think what we would say is we have not studied all schools and districts in Wyoming, so we can't say which ones are doing X, Y, and Z and which ones are doing something that more reflects the model. But one reason that we did the cases is we wanted to see if we could learn from some schools in Wyoming that were making improvements or that were producing performance at a high level, and look at what they are doing. So I think we can make some statements about what can be done to improve performance, but we can't answer the question why everybody hasn't been doing that. But I could add a couple of points to that. This has also been a dilemma in other states. And in many other states, the legislature has been sort of had a similar perspective to, I think, the Wyoming legislator, and that is we will provide the money and then we will trust our local educators to use the money in the most effective manner. And then we have looked, as we have in Wyoming, at how they've used the money. And what we found, and this is a study back in 2006-07 in Wyoming and in 3 or 4 other states, is that although the model may give them a number or money for instructional coaches, there are many fewer instructional coaches in those school districts. Although the model might give them resources to hire teacher interventionists or teacher tutors, oftentimes those dollars are used for instructional aides. And in those studies, we've also found that the improvement level hasn't been as much as desired. So some states then have come along and had, I don't want to say an accountability system, but they've done a series of things either to provide leadership to local school districts to kind of help them use the resources more effectively, or put in place an accountability system to kind of put some performance pressure on the system, or other kinds of activities. So I think one of the things we would say is that maybe that could be something that could be done in Wyoming as well. That is, have some performance pressure placed on local schools and local school districts, so that everybody knows that you're tracking improvements in performance. And if the goal is set at 80 to 90% of proficiency, what progress is being made towards that objective? I don't know, Larry may want to add some comments.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Senator Hicks, I think I agree with Alan in his assessment of that. I would add that, of course, to maybe put a pin in one of the things he said is remember that the Wyoming model is a block grant model. And so while this generates a set of resources, it does make the assumption that the people at the local schools are best able to decide what best meets the needs of the students in their own school district. What I think we're finding in the case studies, we'll talk more about those in October, but I think I agree that and what we find in other case studies is schools that use the strategies that are embedded in the evidence-based model are the schools that we've identified as making large improvements in student performance tend to follow the strategies that are embedded in the evidence-based model. It's also a need to be sure to identify and employ people who are qualified to do the work and then are strong leaders who lead teachers to continue to do it. And it's hard work that is continuous work, and figuring out how to do it and working very hard in year one doesn't give you anything for year two, because you have a different group of students and you have to do it again at that level. So this is hard work and a continuous hard efforts to get there. So we don't want to, I don't think there was a whole literature at one time about how if you spend more money, schools should improve, and most people don't argue at the point that if you spend more, you should do better. Making that specific link is much harder to do. It's because we're dealing with people and human beings and interactions. It's very different than production in other areas where the application of additional labor or additional capital often may lead to improvements in quantity or quality or something like that more straightforwardly. The production function is we've yet to be able to measure it perfectly, and probably don't ever have the tools to measure it in the way we can. The production of things that we might manufacture for other kinds of goods.
Well, Mr. Chairman, a follow-up based on the answers there. If the higher performing schools, and when I say higher performing schools, I mean student performance, tend to follow the model a lot closer. When we look at the CREW report that comes out, what we find out is there's large deviations from what schools are spending and because of the block grant concept than what we actually fund in the model. So I would ask both gentlemen, based on the answer there, if we constrain those districts in the block grant to reflect more accurately how they spend that money that reflects closer to the model, would we expect better performance? In other words, let me simplify the question. We just give the money in a block grant and the districts spend it however they want. With the model, and if I heard your answers correctly, the districts that more closely follow the model have a higher level of performance. So getting back to one of those legislative incentives or constraints, wouldn't we be better off restricting how those monies could be spent, more reflective of the model versus just a block grant?
Doctor or doctor?
We're tossing a coin across the right here, but I'll let Dr. Iden go first here.
Okay, you raise a big, broad issue about what the state could do to try to squeeze more performance out of the system. And one set of strategies would be to ensure that at least some portion of the elements in the model are only spent on those elements. So for example, for a while you did that with instructional coaches. And so that only the money that was allocated for instructional coaches were spent on instructional coaches. You did that for a while on summer school and extended day programs. But when you rolled them into the model, then districts spent less of the money that they were given on those elements and more on something else, which in many cases was higher salaries. So I don't think we're prepared today to answer the broader question. Another approach, rather than restricting how districts spend every element, could be restricting some elements. A related approach could be to have some kind of accountability system that could be hard edged or medium edged or soft edged, to sort of say you want more performance and you're going to be tracking schools and districts to see if you're getting more performance, and then doing some analysis of why you are getting more performance or not getting more performance. So I would say you raise a very large issue. But if you were to ask Larry and I, and Larry said this, how should schools and districts use the resources that are in the model? They're there because both from research on the individual element and from case studies, now in Wyoming, although we don't have all the case study analysis done, but in other states, this is generally how school districts have used resources to move the student achievement needle.
Dr. Pikus, did you have anything else to add before we move
Mr.
on?
Chair, I would say in the interest of time and moving forward, I have nothing really I need to add to what Dr. Oden said.
Okay, thank you. Anything further before we move on to our 9:15 agenda item, instructional resources?
Mr. Chairman.
Co-Chairman Summers, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And so, to Dr. Oden's point of accountability model, as Chairman Coe fully knows, we've implemented an accountability model. We track all those things. And in fact, and then actually, we at one time had money for a system of supports to actually support low performing districts, but we do in fact highlight that. I think it is also interesting over time that if you track Wyoming's, how we rate amongst other states in totality, you'll find that we have improved. But my question back to the doctors, and that is, over time, you've always supported a block grant model. And in fact, so did the Supreme Court in one of its decisions support a block grant model. So I guess the question I think Senator Hicks is asking, and it's a worthy question, is, are you changing your mind? Obviously, in your report, you still, on certain pieces, whether that's extended day or summer school, you've said that should be moved outside the block grant. But the rest of it, it looks to me like, by reading your report, you still have all that in a block grant. Is that not correct, except those few items?
Mr. Co-Chair and Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee, I think we've pretty much consistently recommended that the instructional facilitator money be in a block grant. And I think the tutoring money and maybe extended day and summer school, the IFs be in a categorical program outside the block grant, as well as the tutoring money and perhaps extended day and summer. But I think those are the only ones that we would recommend be outside at this point.
I agree.
Okay,
I
any
guess
further before we move on?
One other thing I should say is, and I think I want to have to wait for this discussion until later, the big issue, and this has come up with the professional judgment panel, is the numbers of teachers for core teachers and elective teachers and the salaries. But let's wait for that till we get to the next section, because that's the other big diversion here in terms of what's gone on with the use of the money.
Okay, thank you. As we move into our 9:15 topic, which is the instructional resources, I just want to make a note that myself and Co-Chairman Summers sent a series of questions to Drs. Pikus and Oden that we ask that they address as they go through each of the elements. Principally, It's how strong is the evidence for any particular component? In other words, if we can't fund everything fully as we have traditionally in the past, which are the most critical elements in terms of predicting educational outcomes and which are less critical, which have the strongest evidence and which has the least strength in predictive power. And that underlays all of the questions that Chairman Summers and I directed to them. And that's going to be something that I and I hope other members of the committee circle around to as we cover each of these segments, starting with instructional resources, draft recalibration report. Drs. Pikus and Odden, I'll turn it back over to you to start with element 1, full day kindergarten.
Mr. Co-Chair,
I think you have some questions.
Co-Chairman Summers.
Mr. Co-Chairman, I think we still have some questions from the body. I think I saw
Oh, okay, well,
Senator Rothfuss, Senator Coe, and Representative Harshman.
okay, thank you. My screen, a lot of people are just frozen figures on my screen. Speaker Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, and maybe Matt can answer this, but is the committee going to receive kind of a report on the crew report, just so we make sure we're reading it correctly and that it's been a few years since we've kind of had that information. And you know, just working from the past, it seemed like, you know, because we used to have instructional facilitators as a categorical grant. We used to have summer school extended day. We changed that with the budget cuts back in 2016. I lost by 1 vote in the House on making tutors categorical back in 2009, I think. But it seems like the crew report showed that we're about 90% congruent with the model. And I just want to know, you know, and like, seems like teachers are 97%. Last time I looked at it, 97% of the teacher money actually goes to teachers. And so are we going to get an update on that, I guess, is my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wilmarth.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Speaker, so at your June 24th and 25th meeting, the Department of Education presented the information on how districts allocate. So the department has provided that to the committee. I've included the most recent school year on the staffing levels in meeting material item 3.03. I'll review that likely at the end of tomorrow or partway through tomorrow after all the presentations from Dr. Pikus and Dr. Odden. So we can certainly show that information on how through each of the 3 models, and I'll call those the legislative model, then the 2015 and 2020 evidence-based model recommendations. So we can show the committee how those allocations on the district side compare to each of the models. Hope that answers some of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Speaker Harshman. Who else did I miss? I've got a lot of figures.
Mr. Chairman, you have Senator Rothfuss, Senator Coe, and Representative Connolly, I believe, still to address.
Okay. Senator Rothfuss, then Senator Coe, then Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to follow up on my earlier question about the 90th percentile as an objective and the discussion there. It sounds noble, and we have that as a high goal concept that we see in the 2 sub point on page 7, I believe it is. But my question is, or it's page 8, my question for Drs. Pikus and Odden is, you know, are these realistic objectives? And I ask that because it was intimated a moment ago in the first question I asked that, for example, we could look to NAEP and try and achieve a 90 percentile proficiency on 90% of our students proficient on NAEP. But my understanding is no state has ever achieved 60% proficient on NAEP at any point on any of the tests. So when we're trying to think, are we succeeding and are we moving towards the goal? Are we making progress each year? When we hear 3 to 5 years, we should be 90% proficient. I don't know how the data supports that as a rational objective or goal or expectation for us as a legislature. So my question is, and maybe it's not something that could be answered today, but I'd sure like to see it for next time. When we look at size effects and we look at standard deviation effects of this approach to a funding model, what is a realistic success story for the state of Wyoming based on data, not based on speculation? Because if we're setting cut scores at ourselves, there's no way the model can be assuring a 90% proficient from cut scores that we arbitrarily set. So from a NAEP standpoint or from any other standpoint, if I'll ask you today, what can we realistically expect in 3 to 5 years? And then I'll ask for follow-up with data.
Well, Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Rothfuss, I would say the 3 to 5 year time period would be for schools that are significantly below, let's say 80%. Let's say they're at 40% at or above proficiency. It seems to me it would be reasonable to expect that over a 3 to 5 year time period, they could go to 50, 55, or 60%. So that over time, if all schools set some kind of goals like that, the state would be moving forward and be moving up. When we looked at the NAEP data that were presented at the last meeting, there were increases from like 2005 to 2007, but our take was that the NAEP scores stayed pretty much constant from 2007 to the current time. And it's really up to you all to decide whether that is acceptable or not. But I think we would argue that given what's in the Wyoming model, that more performance improvement could be expected. So I would say setting a goal, a state goal of 80% at or above proficiency is a reasonable goal. And if you didn't attain that goal over a 5 year time period, what you would clearly want to see is significant movement towards that goal. And
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Auden, though, I mean, if we're talking about NAEP, no state has ever achieved on any of these test categories the 60% proficiency.
Senator Rothfuss, please. If we're going to have a back and forth dialogue, could you please have your questions go through the chair?
I said, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. I'm having trouble here.
Okay, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Auden, no state has ever achieved a 60% proficiency on NAEP in any category. How would we get to 80?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Rothfuss, I would start with 80% at or above proficiency on the YTOP is where I would start. You're sort of asking what's the super long-term goal? And I think one could debate that, but I would say that the short to medium term goal would be to see significant improvement in performance on your own state assessment. And going back to Senator Hicker, I've forgotten who asked this, without changing the standards on your state test. But if you kept those standards the same and said, we want to see improvements statewide, and particularly for schools and districts where under 50% of the kids are performing at proficiency, we want to see movement. That's where I would start.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Auden, I'd ask then for the next meeting, if you could take a look and perhaps work with the folks that worked on YTOP, get an understanding of what a couple of standard deviations would look like in terms of improvement, and then take into consideration the effect sizes that the recommendations represent, and come back to us with what we could expect a realistic gain in 3 to 5 years would be if we were firing on all cylinders. I'd appreciate seeing that, because I do have the same concerns with YTOP, that where we set the cut score, 80% might not be achievable in 3 to 5 years. And I'd like to understand that better. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Odden.
Thank you. Senator Coe?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I don't have a question. I was trying to get your attention because Senator Rothfuss and Speaker Harshman were trying to ask questions.
Okay. Representative Connolly?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Doctors Odden and Pikus, I want to go back to the question or the concern about the achievement on either the YTOP or NAEP as it's related to resources and the evidence-based model. And it seemed to me that the question was in part predicated on a belief that there is a correlation and perhaps even a linear correlation between the two. And so I'd like for you to talk a little bit about kind of that assumption about the relationship between resources and scores. And honestly, my belief that that is not linear. In fact, it's almost logarithmic, it would seem to me. But could you talk a little bit about that? Because ultimately we are going to be talking about the level of resources that we want and then the achievement of our students with adequacy, honestly, as the floor.
Well, I'll try, Senator, Mr. Co-Chair and Representative Conley. I think what Larry and I would say is that we agree with you that it's hard to make a linear correlation between resources and performance. So where we would go is, what are schools doing with the resources? And the way we answer that is, we've looked at schools that have moved the needle. And others have also looked at schools that have moved the student performance needle by substantial percentage points. Whether they got all the way up to 90% or 80% is one issue. Some do, but some move from a lower level and move by 10 to 15 to 20 percentage points over a 3 to 5 year time period. And what they do is they organize teachers into professional learning communities. They provide those professional learning communities with resources to engage in ongoing professional development and analyzing student performance data. They usually provide instructional coaches, instructional facilities for facilitators to those PLCs. They work on effective instructional strategies and deliver those instructional strategies and then assess the effectiveness of the work. They also, schools that move the needle, provide a multitude of extra help strategies for kids who can't get up to a performance level with the core instruction. So that's what I would look for. Rather than a correlation between resource levels and performance, I would look at what's going on in schools to see if the kinds of activities that I just described are going on in schools. And we've got 10 cases in Wyoming, so we can talk about those next time. And I would say in the main, they're doing some version of that. So there's examples in Wyoming of places that have moved the needle or produced high levels of performance. And we're sort of assuming that if school A can do it, school B can do it. If they did engage in similar kinds of activities. That would be our argument.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Odden.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any questions before we leave overview of the evidence-based model?
Mr. Chairman,
Who's that? Senator Hicks.
yeah, so Larry and Alan, it looks like, what if I can paraphrase what you said, performance isn't necessarily based on the level of the resources, but rather the deployment, how those resources are deployed would characterize that. And so the question I have that's going to come back over and over again. So when you look at your 10 base cases, did you look at small rural schools and then what we would consider rural in Wyoming and then larger schools and across the board? And it's going to come back to the same question I have moving forward. If there is a commonality that we see both small schools and larger schools performing based on the deployment of those resources, then it should suggest in the model that that's a very successful model and that we ought to try to move that direction across the board with all schools. So I would really like when we get to those model schools that you looked at, those performance-based 10, is to characterize those, and if there's any commonalities between the ones that more closely in and use the facilitators and that stuff, is there some real strong commonalities there that we can come back to and say, this is some of the things that you will fund at that level? Because I do think it begs the question, as you have stated, it's the deployment of those resources that means everything, not just how much we throw out there.
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Hicks, that's exactly my point. Thank you for saying it in a much straightforward, simpler way. Appreciate that, but that's exactly the point. It's how the resources are used. And Kathleen has just switched on her camera, and she may want to offer a couple of comments that, again, these are preliminary findings from the Wyoming cases.
Yes, I wanted to, Mr. Chair, Senator Hicks, I wanted to directly answer the question that you asked, which was, did you include schools of a range of sizes? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, we did. And as we've mentioned, we'll speak more about the findings at the next meeting next month. But I do think that, I would argue that our findings do illuminate some of these themes that you're discussing. And what we've prepared for this meeting, because we can only speak in preliminary findings now, what we've prepared for this meeting for tomorrow afternoon is to discuss in more detail a school that has been consistently high performing in your state, and a school that's been doing so with relatively large percentages of at-risk students. So while these data are qualitative in nature and not quantitative, as I understand that Senator Rothfuss, your question is to provide quantitative data. I understand that. But hopefully what we'll be able to talk about a little bit more in detail tomorrow is some qualitative data that gets at some of these non-causal but very illustrative linkages of deployment of resources.
Anyone else? Okay, if not, Doctor, would you begin walking us through instructional resources? First element.
Mr. Chair, I'll be glad to do so. I would like to, if I can, a while back in the order, Representative Summers asked about trying to minimize my slides so that he could see more things. I'm not sure that would actually make that happen. I think if I shrunk down the size of my presentation, all that would happen is you'd have the same area with a smaller set of the PowerPoints looking smaller. I don't know if you can turn off the sharing on your screen, and if you are able to do that on pages 19 for about the next 20 pages, we have all of the things that you're going to see on our screen summarized in the summary table, which is table 3.0. That'll help. The other option is to see if the technical people at the legislature can help you find ways to improve that kind of visualization. I'm not quite sure how to do it beyond that, but I fear if I just minimize my screen over here, you'll just all have a smaller thing, and it'll be harder to see that as well.
Doctor, he just meant during the Q&A. Go ahead and share it. He just wanted to minimize.
Okay. Mr. Chair, if that's what you mean next time, I'll be happy to turn off the share during the quick Q&A. My apologies for misunderstanding. I don't think I need to go through this order of presentation slide in any great detail. It's what's in your agenda. So we'll start with looking at instructional resources, which are the full day kindergarten, elementary core teachers, secondary core teachers, elective and specialist teachers, then CTE, vocational education, and then some work that we've done around the issue of minimum numbers of teachers for particularly for small schools. We start with full day kindergarten. What I'd like to say is,
Mr. Co-Chair.
Please, Co-Chair Summers.
Mr. Co-Chair, thank you. Dr. Pikus, if you would share your screen now, that would then pop up to the rest of us. Thank you.
You should see it now. I was unaware that it had disappeared. Representative Summers, do you have the screen now?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My apologies. I had not realized that it had gone away. For these next 3 or 4 categories, kindergarten, elementary schools, and secondary schools, they tend to be very interlinked in terms of the resources and the discussion of it. I often find, and we found in working through our 18 professional judgment panels, that sometimes it was easier to go through the 3 or 4 things combined and discuss what we've learned, and then sort of talk overall about what we learned about those. So let me try to do that and see if that makes sense. But we start with full day kindergarten. The evidence-based model is designed on the fact that full day kindergarten is essential and should be provided. We have recommended that in each of the other previous recalibrations and every other adequacy study that we've done in all the other states where we've worked. And the legislative model is roughly similar. It requires that 1 school in each district must have a full day kindergarten. I don't have data on whether full day kindergartens are offered at every school or not, but it certainly was my sense from conversations with professional judgment panels that if there are schools that are not providing full day kindergarten, they're rare and they're very, very few of them. And no school district said they weren't trying to get to it. So we don't think that there's any real staff difference between what the legislative model would expect and what ours would in terms of providing a full day kindergarten within the context of the next slide, which is elementary core teachers and class size. And in the evidence-based model, we have consistently proposed that let me back up let me talk about class sizes, and then let me give a short thing on class sizes and class ratio and student teacher ratios. We've always recommended class sizes of 15:1 in grades K through 3 and 25:1 in grades 4 and above. That's been our recommendation. That leads to average class sizes in an elementary school of just over 17 in a K through 5 school and just over 18 in a K through 6 school. The legislative model uses 16:1 in grades K through 5 or 6. The distinction being whether this elementary school itself is a K through 5 or K through 6 school, and then for above that, the ratio for secondary schools is 21, which I'll show you in a moment. The reason for this difference, the 16 and 21 that were in the earlier model, the MAP model, so-called MAP model, were assumed to be a pupil staff ratio, and that 16 staff or 16 teachers were expected to not only teach the core classes, but also to provide the additional resources to ensure there were enough teachers to teach elective courses, so that the actual size of any individual class probably would exceed those 16 and 21 numbers. The evidence-based model is, as I'll show you when I get 2 more slides down the road, is designed that the intent very much is a K through 3 class actually has 15 children in it and no more, and that on average, and that a 4 and above is 25, and then we provide resources for elective teachers. Because that was sort of all meshed into one with the 16 and 21 class ratios, there's something of a difference in the way the 2 models operate. The effect is when we, in 2005, when the legislature chose to implement 16 in elementary schools and 21 in secondary schools, and then added on the elective teachers beyond that, it generated a large number of teachers, substantially more than this particular model than the evidence-based model would generate. Secondary core teachers are 21 in the legislative model, 25 in the evidence-based model. If I go back, what you can see is if the evidence-based model were used rather than the legislative model, there would be 273 fewer FTE than the legislative model generates. If we, in the high schools, middle schools would have 149 fewer FTE generated in the evidence-based model and 159 fewer at the high school level. Now, when we go to electives, you see that the other, we'll get to in a minute, those differences exist between the 2 models. When we then looked at the CRU report, and the numbers are in the draft report that we sent you, school districts employ substantially fewer core teachers than the model generates. And in our conversations around the professional judgment panels and then in meetings with groups of school superintendents beyond that, both to talk about salary issues with Professor Stoddard, who you'll see in October, and excuse me, in a session that we had with one session that we had with a group of small school district superintendents. It appears that what's happening is districts are paying salaries that are higher than the salaries in the model, and then hiring fewer teachers as a choice that they're making within the block grant. Again, in October, you'll have a report on how well the salary model reflects the current market for teachers. And at that point, you'll be able to start making choices around funding teacher salary levels as well as numbers of teachers. Given that our model says K through 3 are 15 students in a class, or 15 to 1, and secondary are 25 to 1, we then also provide what we call specialist or elective teachers. And these are teachers at the elementary school. They teach classes like PE, music, art, other those kinds of classes that are important to a fully rounded education for all students. They provide some time during the day for the core teacher to have time to meet in collaborative groups and PLCs, to have time to do their own planning for their coursework. We, in the high school, elective teachers would teach elective courses. And as you're probably familiar, in most schools, students tend to take more courses per day than teachers actually teach. So our model is based on assumption that students take 6 classes a day, teachers teach 5. And so you would need elective and specialist teachers in order to ensure that there were enough teachers that class sizes would average 25 per class, or in the legislative model, 21 per class. We estimate that the evidence-based model assumes that there would be 20% of the core elementary school teachers generated at school, 20% more would be provided for elective teachers in elementary school and at a middle school. And that would provide adequate resources for planning, for covering electives, and keeping class sizes, if there's departmentalized instruction in the middle school, to about 25. At the high school, many high schools use block schedules, where a student, rather than taking one period each hour of the day, on certain days of the week, they take a class for the equivalent, if you will, of 2 periods. And then the next day they take a second class for those 2 periods. So they roughly take a class every other day. There are various models of this because there's an odd number of days in the week. Some think about a 10-day schedule. Some have a different schedule on, say, Friday than the rest of the week. But the idea is, do you have longer periods of instruction? And if you had a block scheduling model in a high school that assumed 2 blocks before lunch and 2 blocks after lunch, and you wanted to provide a block every day for teachers to have time for planning and collaboration, you'd need roughly a third more teachers at the high school. So the evidence-based model recommends 33 1/3% of core high school teachers. If you look closely at our slide, you'll notice that the legislative model at the high school says 33 rather than 33 1/3. I think it was a bill drafting issue, understanding issue, and then a ruling about what it meant back in 2005. But the idea is, in the vicinity of a third of the number of core teachers are provided as elective teachers. The bigger difference between the legislative model and the evidence-based model, and this difference has been consistent since 2005, is that while we propose 20%, we recommend 20% additional core middle school teachers, the legislative model provides a third more. Now, if you were to use the recommendations in the evidence-based model instead of the legislative model, you can see that there would be 55 fewer FTE at the elementary school. And that's because the 15 and the 25 averages to something more than the 16 that's in the legislative model. So there'd be a few fewer teachers. The big difference in the middle school, where the evidence-based model generates 151 fewer FTE teachers, is a function of 20 elective teachers versus 33% elective teachers. And then again, in the high school, the 49 fewer core elective teachers is a function of applying the third percentage to fewer total teachers that are generated because of a 25 ratio rather than a 21. So that generates the bulk of the teaching personnel in any school district, and a large, obviously a huge share of the total resources and total dollars that flow to any school district, because teachers represent something on the order of half of the employees of all school districts in the state. So obviously this is a very large portion of the total. That is the way that this works for elective teachers and core teachers. The two other topics we want to talk about is, as I understand, Mr. Chair, the intent was for me to get through the next two slides as well, and then open this up for questions. I'll proceed in that way, unless you direct me otherwise.
Please
The
proceed.
evidence-based model. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chair, members of the committee. The evidence-based model does not include additional teachers for vocational education or career and technical education programs. We have done that.
You mean that, Larry?
I'm sorry? Do you want to jump in?
The model does, but we don't include, the EB model doesn't include additional to lower the class size.
I'm going to let you continue with that, because I'm not sure that was clear to me.
Okay, so the EB model has always included staff, for vocational education and career technical education. They're taken out of the elective allocation. So that some of the electives would be art, music, and band, and PE, and some of the electives would be career technical and voc ed classes. What this element here, 5, refers to, and there's quite a bit of research that CTE programs, where the students take at least a sequence of 3 classes that are linked, have a positive effect on student performance, both in terms of sometimes performance in math and science, sometimes in high school graduation, and sometimes in kind of post-secondary performance. The issue here is, are there additional teachers to reduce the sizes of some of those CTE classes? For example, for welding classes or for metal classes, to be something smaller than, so for the legislative model would be 21, or for the EB model would be 25. And the EB model has historically argued that to move away from the legacy CTE programs and more towards the high skill, high wage CTE programs that are in the computer technology arena and the health arena and other high technology arenas. And so the difference here is that the EB model does not include this additional 29% weight to lower the class size. The legislative model does. It totals a total amount of 39 additional teachers that's provided by the legislative model. We did ask in the professional judgment panels, since not all CTE courses require the small class size, could this extra 29% or 30% be halved so that only the small number of CET courses that need to be smaller would receive the additional allocation? And we pretty much got negative feedback on that. But nevertheless, the EB model continues to provide no additional teachers for vocational education to reduce class size, while the legislative model does. And I'm wondering, Larry, if we should discuss all this now, or Mr. Co-Chair, because the minimum teachers are sort of an issue onto itself.
I think that makes some sense. The one thing I think I would add is I was going to do just a little bit on the research on class size, which has been fairly consistent over the years. There's some small body of research in experimental design research, mostly around a study called Tennessee Star, which did show that smaller class sizes were important, but really through grades 3. Beyond that, there's substantially less kind of experimental research, and 25 for grades above that have been a number that we think shows what good practice has been and what works, although there's less hardcore research base to reach those numbers. Alan went through the voc ed research. I was heading in that direction, but honestly, he said it better than I would have. So I was glad to let him jump in and do it. The one of the questions that is asked in the questions that the co-chair sent us in advance about ranking items and what order would things be in. One of the things to point out is that reducing class sizes is an incredibly expensive proposition because it requires many more teachers, and that will show some alternatives, not alternatives, that's the wrong word, but some additional resources that districts use around instructional facilitators or coaches, tutors for children, and resources for struggling children that may be more effective in improving performance in the long run than simply reducing class sizes across the board, particularly in a state where the funding model currently provides for generally quite small class sizes at all grade levels. But I think if it is acceptable to the co-chairs, it might make sense to talk about the research on class sizes at this point and CTE, and then we can talk about minimum class sizes following those questions.
Please proceed.
With the minimum class sizes, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please. You were going to talk about the research. In other words, you're not moving on to, are you moving on to number 6, minimum teachers, when you say
that would Alan's suggestion was that we stop here and talk about if there's anything around the class size.
And I'm okay with that.
Brief summary of the class size.
I'm okay with that. I didn't know whether when you said minimum, whether you were talking about minimum teachers or the evidence on class sizes. Are you prepared to take questions on the first 5 elements now? Is that what you'd like?
Yes, I think that would be, Mr. Chair, that would be our thought. Yes.
Okay, I'll open it up to members. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and Dr. Zodden and Pikus, on the class size, a lot of weight is put on the Tennessee Star study, and for good reason. Obviously, there was a tremendous amount of good data available from that. But it's my understanding that it was not a study beyond 3rd grade. So the conclusion that can be drawn from the study is that K3 class sizes that are small, 15 based on your recommendation, show a positive effect, but there is not sufficient data like for grade 4 to conclude, which is why you recommend 25-1. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chair, Senator Rothfuss, I think that's very much what our general conclusion is.
Quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
So is there any new data or new research over the last few years that tries to focus on those 4, 5, and 6 grades, or even the higher grades that we haven't seen? So that we can get a better understanding, because it just, I mean, from an intuitive standpoint, it seems pretty odd that it's critical that we've got 15-1 in grade 3, but in grade 4, it just doesn't matter anymore, right? That just seems a little unlikely, but I realize we're being data driven on this. Is there any one that's working on that now? Is there any research underway? What should we be looking at to better understand the importance of grade size in 4 through 6 or in junior high or high school?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Rothfuss, we are not aware of any randomized controlled trial or even close to that kind of research on class size in the upper grades. We picked 25 for those grade levels, in part drawing from high performance school models, largely that were developed in the end of the last century. Sorry, it sounds so long ago, in the 90s, the late 90s, from the New American Schools. And so let's say that's best practices. So the model class size for all of those schools, and there were like 6 or 7 different models, were 25, both K through 12. So we've only been able to find, as you say, the research for K to 3. And one of the things we would say is that, again, since that averages 17 for a K-5 school, 18 for a K-6 school. That's just a little bit above your 16. It's a little below what the MAP model had, because the old MAP model staffing ratios implied a class size at the elementary school of 19. So we have 25 in middle and high schools. Across the country, the big concern tends to be much larger class sizes, 30, 35, maybe even 40. And there's probably some kind of intuition that a class size of 25 at the high school level probably going to be better than a class size of 40. That's really not a problem in Wyoming because your schools really have class sizes, let's say between the larger schools, they tend to be in the range of 17, 18, 19. And in your larger districts at the secondary level, they tend to be above 21 and closer to around 25. And one of the things that's happened with the teacher units that have been provided by the 16 and 21 in the legislative model is that those dollars pretty much have never been used to lower class sizes in the larger districts, and they've been used to raise teacher salaries. And that's sort of gotten you into now a pickle because if you ask about whether or not the model can work, this was a Senator Hicks comment on the use of the resources. One of the problems now is since so many districts are paying salaries above the model, our model or the legislative model, no district, pretty much, no district can actually implement all the elements of the model because they've drained off several pieces to provide higher salaries. So actually implementing the model is impossible in most places. And that's a conundrum that's going to have to be figured out. And I'm just saying this because when we got to this issue in the professional judgment panels, every panel said, well, maybe the EB class sizes could work, but we're afraid that if we support that, then that'll just be enacted. And then we won't be able to support our teachers because we're using those dollars now for higher teacher salaries. So they're connected, unfortunately.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Other questions on the first 5 elements?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Bebout, then Representative Summers.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this good discussion. And when I added up the FTE equivalents that you've shown in your previous slides, it comes up to about 875, and we've talked about a number of 1,000 that's out there that the legislative model funds and that your model does not fund. The question I have is when we talk about, or you've mentioned several times that Wyoming has a very rich model, are you talking about your model that you prepared that shows we have 875 or up to 1,000 FTEs that would not be substantiated? Or are you talking about the legislative model that has we put in the language on the smaller classroom size to add the up to 1,000 additional FTEs? Which is it?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator, it's the legislative model, because then if you adopted the EB model, you'd say, let's say approximately 1,000 teachers. That's a good round number. But I think we would also say that even if you adopted the EB model class sizes, which could save you money for that piece, you would still have relatively small, formal small class size allocations in your funding model relative to most other states. Most other states don't get into this level of detail, but I would say only the states of, and Larry, you can help me, North Dakota, Washington, Arkansas, partially implemented the EB model, but their class sizes are a little bit larger. You would still have fairly substantially small class sizes. Part of that is your size. You don't have any big districts with 50,000 kids. But part of it is that even by saving it, your class sizes would still be formally modest in comparison to many other states. But it would follow research and best practices.
Co-Chairman Summers and then Senator Cost.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And just a note, thanks to the good work of Matt Wilmar, the 2020 EB model actually resources 12,947 FTEs compared to the legislative model of 12,815. So actually, the legislative model resources less FTE than the EB model, in totality. So maybe not teachers, but instructional facilitators, tutors, those sorts of things that bounce that up. My question is really around the CTE piece. And I think probably I wasn't around in those days, but certainly Senator Coe was, or Representative Harshman. But classes, the old CTE classes, whether those be mechanic classes, welding classes, those kind of do require smaller class size, which I think is why we have had the bias, I guess, or that little piece of the model differently than you folks. In other words, to try to show that we have to have a decreased class size there. And certainly even going forward in Wyoming, those types of classes are still important. So could you talk to me about, as you reviewed the PJP report, how do you talk about those old traditional CTE courses, which are still very important in Wyoming, and how that relates back to your current report?
Mr. Co-Chair and Mr. Co-Chair, Representative Summers, the EB model has really never supported the legacy folk ed courses. It's always just supported the more high skill, high wage CTE classes. Having said that, what we said in the report is, in a certain sense, this is a policy call that the legislature can make. We tried, if we were pushed to the wall, we would say maybe cut the additional weight to 0.15 rather than 0.29, 0.30, because not all classes need to be smaller. But this is kind of a choice. It's not a super expensive choice. A lot of people in the PJ panels argued for some of these legacy courses. And so there's sort of just a difference of opinion here. And this is clearly a case where we say it may be appropriate for the legislature to say that we're going to keep this 0.29 weight.
And just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you. And kind of back to the block grant, categorical grant, as you roll through the slides, please tell us which things that you feel should be in the block grant and in the categorical. I think it's fairly clear on some of them where you say categorical, but I assume all these elements that we've talked about now, you have in a block grant. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And what the exception here, that at some point, I think you will need to wrestle with this issue of, even though you've allocated the legislative model has allocated all these extra teacher positions, the money has been used largely to raise teacher salaries. And at some point, that dichotomy is going to have to be fixed. Otherwise, again, as I said, districts will never be able to implement whatever model is funded. And we couldn't say, gee, it depends on your deployment of the resources. You could do X, Y, and Z to move the needle, because the salaries are out of whack with the ability to fund all those other positions.
And just a quick follow-up again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that, Dr. Oden. And you will be, through Dr. Stoddard, and I think we made it clear that you will be providing us a salary suggestion. So it's kind of back at you, right?
Well, what I would say, Representative Summers, is you better push Dr. Stoddard to give you a recommendation hard.
Yes.
So next up, I had on my list Senator Cost. I saw Senator Rothfuss had raised his hand. Let's do this. We're scheduled for a break at 10:30. Let's go ahead and take that 10-minute break. And when we come back, we'll pick up with the questions again, starting with Senator Cost, followed by Senator Rothfuss. Karen, I'd like to have a conversation with Dr. Pikus and Otten about their screen share. And so maybe you can have them call me on my cell phone or something. So we'll take a break for 10 minutes, be back at 10:40. Karen, I show 1040.
Yes, sir.
All right, if we just get enough people turning their cameras back on, we'll pick up. Senator Cost, are you there?
Yes, sir, I am here.
All right, let's pick up. We were getting Q&A on the first 5 elements of instructional resources. Question from Senator Cost and then Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is for either one of you. I actually have 2 questions. My first question is in regards to CTE. Ancient years ago, it was called vocational education. That has changed dramatically since then, and obviously it's not anywhere near vocational education. Our business people in the state have definitely spoke out that this is a necessary skill that's needed for our people to be able to fill those areas where there's obviously a need. And I think we're probably finding that out more than just in the state of Wyoming. The plumbers, the welders, all of these different HVAC and all. Yet those programs end up costing more than the other programs. And if you look at the amount of money that's been funded from the state from a number of years ago to now, it has hardly changed at all. It's still a minimal amount. And a lot of people will say that's because of Perkins and the Perkins grant. The Perkins grant doesn't offer a lot of flexibility there for funding. But my concern is by cutting and saying, well, we need to cut that, that's going to affect those programs dramatically. Number one, with welding and with some of the carpentry and with even the foods, culinary and that, you're talking smaller numbers to be able to adequately take care of them in the classroom because of lack of facilities, lack of welders, those kinds of things. So I think a lot more goes into this than just, well, we need to say they've got to have larger class sizes. You know, there's more to good quality jobs than just having a college education. Certification is extremely important. A lot of these jobs can make as much or more than a lot of our college graduates. And I just want to know how you can justify cutting the 1.29% down to 1.15% as a suggestion and still be able to keep these areas where businesses have loudly spoken that we need to keep this skill education going.
Alan, you're on mute.
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Cost, the rationale is that right now the 29% weight is applied to all CTE classes. And since all of them don't need to be small for safety reason, that we thought that if the weight were reduced by to 0.15, it would still produce enough extra for those small number of classes that needed to be smaller. That was the rationale. But again, this is one where the differences are modest, and we kind of say in the report, this is really a legislative call. Those kind of courses are not an EB model, never have been. They may be needed in Wyoming, and this would be a place where you all can and have said over the years, we want them, and we're going to keep the 0.29 weight in the model.
Before we roll over to Senator Roth with his question, I also wanted to be careful to solicit Joint Education Committee members if you may have any questions as well. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think I'll just hold back on this question until we get to Stoddard. So please continue.
All right. Other questions? Senator Cost, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Uh, to both Dr. Pikus and Dr. Oden, do you have data to back that up? I mean, when you say that your EB model has never included those, that kind of concerns me. I would think that evidence-based model would support all education and not just certain types of education, such as only directing it towards collegiate. Um, is there data to say that CTEs are not? I mean, I can't believe that you would just not consider it.
Doctor?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Cost, it's not that it's not that the EB model does not include CTE. The CTE classes are taken out of the elective allocation. And at the high school level, both the EB model and the CTE model provides the same percentage of elective classes versus core classes. The EB model has said in the past that it's supporting the wave or the movement across the country for higher, not just college, that's kind of college bound, but for higher skill, higher wage CET courses, like in computer technologies, in the health center, in nanotechnology. And we were understood from a meeting that we had actually we were there in person in January, that the state is trying to kind of reinforce movement in those directions, that is in between high school and college. And so we sort of stand where we've always stood. We thought we were kind of reinforcing now a movement that has been, we were told, pushed by the State Department, the governor, and I don't know who else. But again, it's not that we don't have CTE classes. We do. It's just that in the EB model, there isn't the extra weight for some of the legacy programs. And again, we say this is one where maybe this is the legislative call and to go ahead and include it.
Further questions? Further questions from committee member, Recal, or Joint Ed? All right. Let's, Doctor, would you pick up then with the element 6, minimum teachers?
Mr. Chair, I've reshared my screen, and I want to follow up on our conversation at the break. There may be a couple of fixes to the challenges you brought forward, and I will work on those at lunch. So hopefully it'll be better. And if you'll bear with me till lunchtime, we'll proceed. The last piece of the instructional resources has to do with what we call minimum teachers. The problem in all states have small rural schools. Wyoming has its share of them as well. Obviously, it's one of the things I think that the state's very proud of is the rural schools and the work that they do. There's fairly good evidence that there are some diseconomies of scale in terms of trying to operate very small schools and ensuring that there are adequate teaching resources and other resources to meet the needs of children. We have looked far and wide over the years to find research that would give us some sense of what research would say about what levels of resources you would need at schools to improve student learning. There's relatively, I'd say relatively little is not accurate. There's none. And the real issue around this has been since the beginning, how do we think about providing adequate resources so that these small schools are able to operate and meet the needs of their students. This has been an issue since 2005, where we had several special panels to work with practitioners to try to come up with solutions. We've worked on it. We had several of our professional judgment panels were devoted to the issue of small schools and how to wrestle with those as well. And we then tried to estimate a wide range of alternative ways to generate how many teachers are needed and how this should work. Our evidence-based model has been modified somewhat since the time of 2005, and it still is different than the legislative model is. And there are two places where we think about how we assign resources to small schools. And the break point is at 49 ADM. And some of you may remember that I also did some work with one of the interim committees on issues around cliff effects and things in small schools and this break point in 2018. We never did find any great solutions to it when one student comes or goes. Any way we try to do this, if we switch from one to the other, a challenge arises, and writing a smooth formula has been hard because the additional resources that come in and out of the model affect where those things happen. So it became very, very, very complicated to work it through. But in its base, what we do is for schools with more than 49 ADM, our recommendation in the past has always been a minimum of 7 elementary, 7 middle, and 7 high school teachers. We've received pushback that those numbers were not enough in many years. The legislature has, in fact, in the legislative model, appropriated a minimum number of teachers of 6 in elementary schools, 8 in high schools, 8 in middle schools, and 10 in high schools. And that has been the general process in the legislative model. In addition, for school districts with fewer than 243 ADM, the model provides a minimum of 1 teacher at each school for every grade level where there are students actually enrolled. Now, at the moment, that affects 5 school districts, and all of them have students enrolled at each grade level. I believe that the next smallest school district, I think there's 1 district that's very close to that 243, but it also has it has students in each grade level, and there's relatively little effect of these minimums. The 7th smallest district is about 100 ADM larger and probably is not impacted by this for the near term. We did a number of prototypical school types for small schools. We tried to estimate how you would allocate enough teachers to ensure that the basket of goods and services could be met. We looked at some of the graduation requirements across school districts to see how many teachers would be needed, particularly at high schools, to make sure that all of the courses could be offered and there were enough teachers to offer those courses. And when we reached then we also spoke at length to the professional judgment panels on small schools. Among the challenges that small school districts face is simply the challenge of finding enough people in the subject areas to meet the needs of the students and the to be taught. They also expressed concern that the Wyoming Board for Professional Teacher Standards makes it very, very difficult for secondary teachers to have multiple certifications, so that it's hard to find somebody who can teach 2 subjects together. They've worked very hard in many of these small rural districts. Often they have multiple schools on the same general facility or campus or within a few blocks of each other, and they're able to share teachers across schools, across school levels. So they find a lot of solutions. We, after looking at particularly the graduation requirements and the Hathaway scholarship requirements as well, we concluded that perhaps the ideal sort of minimums with more than 49 is 7 teachers again, and still at the elementary and middle schools, but that you need 9 minimum teachers at the high schools. If we used that model with the increase at the elementary school and the one drop in the middle, it appears that we'd need additional 69 FTE for the minimum number of teachers per school in schools with fewer than 49 ADM. The school with the model would also resource a school with 49 or fewer teachers. The whole model includes enough funding for an assistant principal, and then 1 teacher plus 1 teacher up to 7 students, and beyond that, 1 teacher for every 7 students. So at 49, there would be those 7 minimums, and that's what happens below 49 ADM. So you would if you have one of the challenges here, of course, is administrative resources start rolling into how we think about how the school look. But in terms of teachers, with more than 49, the minimums of 7, 7, and 9 are the EB recommendations. It's 6, 8, and 10 for the legislative model, plus the 243 for more than 49 ADM, and generally up to what Alan referred to as sort of a 1-unit school, but 96 ADM at an elementary school, 105 ADM at a middle or high school. The minimums that are in place exist, and below 49, it's basically 1 teacher and 1 per 7 once it goes above 7 students. We do resource other staff elements for students who are struggling, which we'll talk about later in the day, as well in the schools to ensure that there are resources for students with additional needs. Those tend to be very, very small numbers of individuals, and many of the schools generated 1 or fewer teachers. I would say that the professional judgment panels seem to feel that the numbers that we had were probably somewhat thin for the way they tried to organize their schools. We think that probably the schools really can make this work with the numbers that we've put in place. And the concerns, I think, tended to be more around the minimum number of teachers, particularly at the middle and high schools. Alan, I'm not sure if there's anything we need to add to that.
I'd like to add a couple of clarifications. As Larry said, later on, there's an allocation in the legislative model, and in our report, we talk about alternative learning environment schools. These are schools that are really for kids with multiple social, emotional, oftentimes drug abuse, etc., problems. And the legislative model and the department identifies those ALE schools as a special category of schools and funds them with 1 AP position and 1 teacher position for every 7 kids. Exactly the same as this small school formula. Because the EB model assumes that ALE schools should be 49 or fewer kids, the EB model doesn't have a separate allocation for ALE schools. Those ALE schools are resourced right here under the small school model. And that's why what you see here is there's 47 FTE more for small schools under the EB model than the legislative model. But it turns out that when you get to the ALE, there's going to be a certain number of teachers more in the legislative model. So basically they're the same. The reason for the 69 FTE difference is that because the EB model for high schools has larger class sizes, in order for the school, if it gets the high school to get a minimum of 9 teachers, it keeps on getting that minimum up to a higher level of ADM in a high school. This is sort of weedy. And so there are technically more under the minimum teachers, whereas in the legislative model, they would be under just the regular number of teachers in those high schools. So these numbers are a little misleading in terms of whether the 2 models really are substantively different in terms of treating minimum teachers. I would say they're more similar than they're different.
And Mr. Chair, at this point, this sort of gets to a point where we'd have a second set of questions and then move on to the next topic of professional development.
Larry, say that one more time. You chopped out.
I apologize. This is the end of the instructional resources section, and we would move on to professional development. So I think if there are questions related to minimum teachers, we probably should take those now if that's acceptable to you.
Thank you. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And, I would like to thank you guys for hearing us on this issue and examining it and providing a kind of a different recommendation. The one question, and I'm sure you answered it in this, but when I read under your 2020 line there, it says, for schools with 49 or fewer ADM resources are provided on the basis of one assistant principal position and one teacher position for every 7 students. So I'm assuming you're not providing one assistant principal position for every 7 students.
That's
Is
right.
that correct?
Mr. Chair, that's correct. It's one assistant principal for the school, and then one teacher for every 7 students with a minimum of 1 teacher.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Schwartz and then Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you made a reference to certification standards and how that impacts these small rural schools. In other states where they have similar situations, have they relaxed certification standards under certain circumstances?
Mr. Chair, Representative Schwartz, I don't believe that they specifically relax the standards for teachers anywhere, but that the requirements to get a second certification are less stringent in other states than they are in Wyoming. The feeling was that the standards for certification in the second area are just much harder to achieve than in most places.
Thank you.
Before we go on to Senator Rothfuss, I'd like some follow-up information on that, Dr. Pikus. It's a big issue for the smaller schools, and even a lot of teachers in larger schools are certification requirements, not to become a teacher, but subject area certification. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that is a good point, Mr. Chairman. I do think we need to learn a little bit more about that and what we can do to help assuage those concerns. I'm also curious what they do in other states and about that for small schools, if we have any information available. But my question, Mr. Chairman, is with regard to the 7 or 1 teacher per 7 ADM for the small school. In the literature you provide and in your recommendations, you talk about the value of grade banding, where, for example, kindergarten and first graders are in the same classroom, second and third graders are in the same classroom, et cetera, and how that's a positive educational experience. And there's literature to support that being a positive educational experience. So my question is, why in small schools wouldn't we just assert that that's taking place? And instead of having what we have now, where we basically we end up with a minimum of 1 teacher per grade level and the 7-to-1 ratio, why wouldn't we maintain something along a 14-to-1 ratio as the minimum with grade banding or something along those lines that reflects that it's okay to put small classes together as long as you still end up with a small classroom with similar graded students? Why don't we have that if that is considered a best practice?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Rothfuss, I think the answer to that is that for small schools, 49 or fewer kids, it's 1 teacher position for every 7 kids, but that's meant to be used for core teachers, elective teachers, counselors, kind of just about instructional coaches. It's a way to resource the school, but the school can then decide how they're going to actually staff up the school. And that's why in the report, in the table in the report, it shows that kind of no small school actually has, if they have 49 kids, have 7 teachers. They have a wide variety of staff, including secretaries, because that's the notion. It's like, we're not quite sure how each one should be staffed up, but here's a bucket of resources plus an administrator, and you figure out how you want to use that bucket of resources across all staffing. So my guess is that a lot of those would have these kind of combination classes.
Senator Bebel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A quick question, getting back to Representative Summers about the 1 assistant, a principal for 49 or fewer ADM. Will you also have a regular principal for that 49 or fewer ADM?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebo, no, that would be the administrative staff at the school or the funding to provide that kind of administrative staff. We would have principal resources would be available following above 49. Principal resources are prorated up to a principal at 96. But there would not be principal resources in addition at those small schools, only resources for an assistant principal.
If I might follow up, Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Bebo, I think another rationale there is it's money for an administrator priced at the level of an assistant principal. In small schools, that might be a sufficient amount of money for a principal, because principals in smaller schools tend to earn lower salaries. But it's simply an amount of money for some kind of administrative resources. The specific position and percentage would be determined by the district and the school.
Well, it just seems to me that in those smaller schools, the most important thing would be the teachers rather than worrying about administrators. So I would agree that we need fewer administrators and, you know, look at how they could be more involved with the teaching side of it. Thank you.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, sorry for holding us up. So the last thing you said, Dr. Oden, actually concerned me, because basically what I just heard you say, that it's okay to have a lower priced principal in a smaller school versus a larger school. So does that mean that, and then that becomes, to me, as that turns over into an equity issue. And I know it happens, but as you resource things, you have that responsibility of equity across schools, across students, across districts. And so I'm going to make you re-explain that. Thank you.
Mr. Co-Chair and Representative Summers, again, it's a bucket of money triggered by this formula that the school and district could use to staff it however they deem appropriate. They might staff a small school with a half-time principal, for example, and that half-time principal might spend other time someplace else, so they could be a half-time administrator and a half-time principal. But rather than get into the specifics of how it would be staffed for very small schools, both the legislative and EB model just provides a bucket of resources and basically says, do it whatever way you think is appropriate. And we've pretty much not received any negative feedback on that particular piece of this over the past 15 years.
Others? Joint education or Recal members, any further questions on element 6 minimum teachers? All right, let's doctor, let's move on then to 6 professional development draft recalibration report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Alan, do you want to take the lead on this part of it, or do you want me to continue?
No, I'll do it.
All right.
So what we've done so far is we've said, here would be the core staffing for schools, teachers and elective teachers. Then the next bucket of, there's quite a bit of research that suggests I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go to professional development. The next issue is what can be done to make sure that all those teaching staff are as effective instructors as possible. And that leads to the professional development recommendations. And I don't see that yet, Larry. And so the way to think about the next 3 elements is that these are all part of professional development. The one thing I can say is that professional development, go to the next slide, Larry. What we have here is instructional coaches, money for training, and we've put back into the model, we didn't take it out, money for short cycle assessments so that teachers can engage in database decision making. What the research shows is that that a lot of professional development isn't any good, unfortunately. But that good professional development really has significant positive impacts. The research also shows that if you're providing professional development to teachers and you don't follow it up with coaching individual teachers in their classroom as they struggle to get those instructional strategies in place, there tends to be no change in instructional strategy and therefore no impact of their professional development. It would be like if you went to the University of Wyoming or the University of Wisconsin or the University of Florida, gave lectures to the football team, and then said to go out there and play football without any coaching. They wouldn't be very good. So the coaching is really critical. And there's been 30 years of coaching research, which shows that coaching really has this impact, significant, and that professional development without coaching has very little impact. So coaches are critical. And this is one place where we would suggest that Wyoming revert to what it used to do, and that is to put the coaching, instructional coaching money into a categorical grant. And over the years, we've had a general allocation, and this again came from some of the New American School, high performing school models of one coach position for every 200 kids. In a 500 kid school, that could be 2 coaching positions for subject areas and a half-time coaching position for kind of embedding technology in the curriculum. The way we wrote that here, going back to these prototypical school sizes, is 1.5 instructional coach position for the 288 or 300 kid elementary school, and 1.5 instructional coach positions for the 315 or close to 300 kid elementary or middle and high school.
Senator Rothfuss.
Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Odden, I was curious about something that you noted in the report itself, which was the idea that obviously you don't have to use a full-time instructional facilitator. You can use portional roles where maybe an employee is a half-time instructional facilitator and a half-time classroom teacher. I'm curious if there's any literature examining the efficacy of full-time IFs that do that as their entire job versus the half-time IF, half-time classroom instructor. And is there a difference there? Or has anyone done that study?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Rothfuss, not that we're aware of. What we've found is that in our case studies is that often you find generally you find full-time IFs. I would say that's the modal pattern. But again, if you want, let's say you're in a 500 kid school and you want an IF for reading and an IF for science and an IF for math, they're going to be part-time. Oftentimes, rather than a classroom teacher, you might be a part-time instructional facilitator coach, and then the other part of your time you might be a tutor or a tier 2 interventionist. So I think we mainly said that to say that you don't always, even if you have 2 positions, that doesn't necessarily mean it's 2 people. It could be parts of multiple people.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
But I don't think there's any research on which staffing pattern is the most effective.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Odden, I say that because one of the concerns I've heard just anecdotally over the years with instructional facilitators is always the idea, well, we don't want to take that person out of the classroom. They're a really good teacher.
Right.
And, you know, the best of both worlds approach there where you can mitigate that concern. I was wondering if that had been something that you'd seen done. It sounds like there isn't research, but I'm curious if anyone knows more. I would be interested in understanding if that's a model that's been used elsewhere.
Doctor?
Well, I don't think, we just don't know research to suggest that one staffing strategy is better than another. The one thing I could say though is that when you have PLCs in schools, they need a leader, somebody to organize the meetings, to kind of moderate the meeting, keep the meeting on track. And sometimes the PLC coordinators are instructional coaches, and sometimes they're lead teachers. So in addition to their full-time teaching jobs, they sort of chair and coordinate a PLC, and that's another model. So what the funding model does is it provides resources for these roles, and it sort of says it understands that there are a variety of ways that schools could use these resources to implement the roles.
Senator Hicks and then Senator Cost.
Yeah, Alan or Larry, either one want to weigh in on this. The question I have when we look at this is on the instructional facilitators and the coaches. Do we know where the vast majority of the time is being deployed? Is it these teachers that are right out of college? Is it somebody that's mid-level in their career? Is it teachers later? I think that becomes very helpful if we knew that to be able to mine that data. So where are we deploying these facilitators and coaches, and where are they most effective? So would we be using a facilitator or a coach with a 20-year classroom teacher that had national board certification versus somebody that had been 3 years? Because what happens when we start looking at our school districts and you look at the average number of years of experience within that teaching staff, that could drive substantial differences. One where you had a district that had a lot of experienced teachers versus one that had a lot of new teachers. But can we mine the data to find out where these facilitators and coaches are being deployed and then where they're most effective when they're deployed?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Hicks, I don't know if we have the quantitative answer to that. I think what I can say is that 2 or 3 things. In the professional judge-on panels that we had, the almost universal comments were that good IFs can help all levels of teachers become better. Clearly new teachers, but also mid-career teachers and also senior teachers. And we had senior teachers tell us that they had been able to work with a really good instructional coach and they became better and better. Oftentimes, if you had a 20-year teacher who was national board certified, I would guess that there would be a high probability that they might be an instructional coach because they'd have at least the instructional skills needed as the prerequisite to be an instructional coach. The other thing is that it goes back to the organization of teachers within schools. If teachers are working alone and not with professional learning communities, then even professional development instructional coaches have a hard time having a major impact. The best way to get an impact of any kind of training and coaching is to organize teachers in these professional learning communities. So they're working together on instructional strategies. You can then in that group, you can have new teachers, mid-career teachers and senior teachers. And over time, maybe turn over some of the IF role to the kind of the leaders in that particular PLC. But we don't exactly know how they're deployed, but people have said, this is also what they've said, that good really are effective. Sometimes they're used as administrators, sometimes they're used as instructional coaches, or excuse me, as substitute teachers. Sometimes they're used to push paperwork. So again, it goes back to the point that was made. The efficacy of instructional coaches really does depend on who they are and how they're used. When they're used well, they can really have a major impact. But there's also an element of they're not being used well. And that would have to be sort of tracked and monitored by the district and by the principal in the school.
Thank you.
I believe Senator Cost was next. I just want to make one note. We do have scheduled public comment at 11:30, and I've got people in the waiting room, so we will break away at 11:30, and then we may have to pick up with professional development after lunch. Please, Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for you guys. First of all, you talk a lot about the collaboration, instruction, and the professional learning communities, PLCs, all of that. But I think the principal and the vice principal or assistant principal should also be added into that mix. And so for professional development as well as for the collaboration and all, I think the principal and the vice principal or assistant principal should also be part of that team, because if the leaders of the school are not part of the push to make sure that this is being followed, the professional development and all, then it's not going to be successful. So I would think those need to be counted in. And has that been taken into consideration with the number of instructional facilitators you have? And then the second question to that is, have you looked at the success of elementary instructional facilitators to middle school to high school? Because I might be wrong, but I think what you're going to find out is in elementary, they're highly effective. In middle school, it's a lot less. And in high school, it's difficult to get into the doors of a lot of the teachers. So I'd just like you to respond to those for me, please.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Cox, let me go backwards. You're right. It's nearly impossible to kind of work oftentimes with high school teachers. Since Larry is still active, it's literally impossible to work with college teachers. So the higher up you go, the harder it is. I think Kathleen will be able to speak to how important professional development was in instructional coaches in some of our K schools at the high school level, but we'll leave that until later. But your point is well taken. It's elementary teachers are just more open to that. Now, in terms of the involvement of the principals, again, I think the way I'm going to answer that is, it's a very good question. And the way I'm going to answer it is the model sort of provides administrators and principals and APs for the administrative functions. And then it really provides instructional coaches for the instructional leadership functions. Now the literature says that you want principals to be involved in instructional leadership. You also need schools to be managed. And so again, how the school orchestrates who does what roles, I think can be somewhat differentiated. If you've got a really good, and I've been in schools like this, a teacher who really knows reading, that principal might play the role of a reading instructional coach. And they may take what in this model might be a part-time position for instructional coach and take that position or part of the position and put it into a managerial role. So the model has resources for administration and management, resources for instructional leadership, and schools should have the flexibility to put those together in kind of the most effective way.
Okay, Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Drs. Auden and Pikus, I was pretty compelled with your narrative in terms of IFs. And it is one of the areas where you are suggesting, if not double downing on the 2015 recommendations, that we go back to providing IFs to a level that was recommended then and now, rather than what we've been doing in the
I'm in the
legislative
middle of
model.
chairing a committee for 2 days.
Oops. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, you were on. I am curious, though, about the narrative where on page 93, you're talking about what IFs in Wyoming will need to do in relationship to content and pedagogical skills to address computational learning and algorithmic thinking, and about their relationship with computer science. So could you talk a little bit more about some kind of real specific recommendations about what IFs will need to do in Wyoming that's probably different than elsewhere?
Mr. Co-Chair and Representative Conley, I'm not quite sure I can be specific about that, other than to say that what we were trying to connote there is that the EB model is fairly robust with instructional coaches, and that what kind of instructional changes or instructional improvements are needed changes over time. And so therefore, with the particular focus or foci of instructional coaching might need to change. So we are trying to say, okay, you've said you want to have computational thinking and computer science in your schools, and we're saying, so therefore probably some instructional facilitator time can be focused on that. Now, one good example of that would be for the in our career technical discussion, we reference Project Lead the Way, and it has a set of programs that includes computational thinking and computer science from kindergarten through the 12th grade. And they have several modules for each elementary, middle, and high school level. And they provide training for teachers, and they provide training for instructional coaches. So that would be a program that one could access to provide training for some of your instructional facilitators to have the skills to help teachers implement those components of Project Lead the Way on computational thinking and computer science. Admittedly, computer science at the high school level is a little different kind of an issue, and probably you simply need to be trained in computer programming before you can teach that course.
Mr. Chairman, follow up.
Please.
And so thank you, Dr. Aden. And then I was curious about the professional judgment panels, actually lack of talking about kind of this expanded role for IFs that you're just talking about right now, but also there's somewhat lukewarm support for IFs in general. And again, going back to some of the issues that you did talk about, but is it fair to say that the PGPs were lukewarm?
Mr. Co-Chair and Representative Conley, the answer is no. And here's a possible reason. We said to the PJ panels, we want you to give us input on what's needed for your schools to produce large improvements in student learning. And when we said that, they said, we need IFs, and the state needs to fully fund IFs. And they said, we need tutors, and the state needs to fully fund the tutors. I think if you got rid of that admonition of we want large improvements in student learning, they said whatever. But when you added the performance improvement, they said pretty much uniformly, IFs are core and critical.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's an important point to make, Dr. Aden.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Bebout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And committee, I've always struggled with the IF portion of our school foundation program and how we implement it. Part of it comes from talking with teachers, and of course, some think it's a great idea, and some think it's not a good idea, and it's a waste of time and money. The question I have when you look at other states, you know, we're clearly one of the, I think there's 3 or 4 that implement like we do, maybe a few others are looking at it. And then I look at it from a business perspective, and there's no question about it that, you know, when they first come out of college and they get into the teaching profession, that there's some need there. But, you know, that's to me would be short-lived, but to have it to be ongoing is where I run into some issues. And there again, not knowing if you hire a teacher, you know, they would advance from, you know, I think elementary, stay elementary, middle school there, high school there. So certainly on the front end of it, you would need them, but the continuation is where I have more of a problem with. So how would you respond to that, one of you two?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Bebout, what I would say 2 things. Number one, almost all the schools that we've studied and others have studied identify instructional coaches as a core and critical element of their school improvement strategy. There may be a rare school here or there that doesn't have them, but there are 2 things that have emerged in the past 20 years on schools that have moved the student achievement needle. One is organizing teachers in professional learning communities, which are work groups, not just, you know, discussion groups, and the use of instructional coaches. So that's what I would say. It just comes out all the time. And the other thing I would say is, I hear what you're saying in some businesses, but again, I'd go back to the sports analogy. You may follow the Denver Broncos or the Minnesota Vikings. They all went through college. They all went through high school, college. They're paid millions of dollars, and those teams spend millions of dollars on their coaches. And even the all pros are coached in technique and foot placement and hand placement and movements. And that's simply just a metaphor that a lot of activities require ongoing coaching. And even for senior teachers or mid-career teachers, things change. Teachers didn't have to teach algorithmic thinking in Wyoming until recently. The nature of children changed. We, for example, have been recommending in Wyoming and other states that the way to provide good services for ELL students is to have all teachers trained in sheltered English, so that rather than putting an aide in there who's not trained but may know the second language, or having co-teaching, which is more expensive, you give the regular core classroom teacher more skills so that they can teach content and language development at the same time. And again, that's a point of as the demographics of the kids change, teachers might need different skills, and therefore instructional coaching can help provide that. But that's, Larry may want to add to that, but those would be two or three.
Well, yeah, but I would take exception to your comparison to coaches. I certainly, you have coaches, you have specific position. There's a member of this committee that knows a lot more about coaching than I do, and he's been very successful at it. We don't have coaches out there teaching coaches. Coaches are there for specific ideas, just like a specific teachers would teach specific classes, specific courses. So that I don't agree with that analogy at all.
Okay.
We're going to take a quick break from the questions on this particular element. We're scheduled at 11:30 for comment, and we have some people in the waiting room waiting. The first is going to be two folks from Converse County School District number 2, Casey Tillard and Coley Shadrick. They and these other folks signed up under general comments, and so this is a convenient place to hear their concerns and comments regarding the recalibration draft report. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, this is Albert. Could we thank you, Dr. Pikus.
I lost my Converse County guys. Where are they?
Mr. Chair, I'm here. I'm at Converse County though.
There they are. They're back. Okay, Coley and Casey, introduce yourselves, and you're on. Hear their concerns and comments regarding the recalibration draft report. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, one thing about the commenters is they have to shut down their YouTube feed or they get a constant feedback, Mr. Chairman.
Did you hear that, gentlemen? You need to shut down your YouTube feed.
Yep. Can you hear us now?
You're loud and clear.
Okay. Well, thanks for letting us be on here. We are in the current, we're in a power outage here in Glen Rock. So we had to get a little bit problem solving. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Casey Tillard, who is our board chair, because I think he's got very important things, and I think you guys want to hear from your elected officials.
I'm Casey Tillard, and I apologize if I don't follow the correct decorum or not, but I am very thankful for what you guys are doing. I appreciate it. I know it's not easy. Cuts are never fun. A few things I wanted to get to, and I might be a little out of order. I know you're going to get to some of this stuff later. But, 4 years ago in 16-17, we were faced with some cuts. So we looked at it from the top down. Our philosophy was try to cut as far away from kids as we could. So we went from 3 administrators to 2. We have 3 buildings. We saved some money. We had a longtime superintendent who stepped down, and we started with a young guy, and we saved some more money there. And what we found after that year is we went from being meeting and exceeding expectations in all our schools to, we were meeting 2 and partially 1, and it just kind of a continued downward spiral. So 2 years ago, we hired another principal. We kind of had to go back and add that administrative level to keep things running. And since then, we've showed some improvement. Also, when we lost, back then when they took the instructional facilitator out of the categorical grant, our scores started to decline also because we were funded 0.45 for an instructional facilitator. And, you know, to get to Dr. Oden keeps talking about paying our teachers more above and beyond what's expected. Well, we get funded here in Glen Rock, kind of oddball. We get 0.45 for an IF. We get partial funding for gifted and talented. So it's not enough to run a full program. So we take that money and try to go out and hire teachers with a master's degree so we can offer dual and concurrent classes. We have kids leaving here with almost a full year of college under their belt. And that's kind of where we spend some of that money. And that's why some of our salaries are higher. And we're between Casper and Douglas. So we have to spend a little bit more money on our salaries to get the teachers that we want. I've got all kinds of stuff here. And then to the CTE, you know, and I understand that, you know, computer technology is a big thing, but here in Glen Rock, Wyoming, you can make more money as a welder, as a plumber, as a carpenter, as an electrician than you can in a computer program right now. So I would hate to see any money pulled out of that program. I think it's very important for not just the kids in our community in Converse County, but for the state. I mean, and you know, through this COVID, through everything, kids are learning more on computers than I ever did. I mean, they're more proficient with computers when they leave now than they were 5 years ago. So I think that computer technology is kind of growing. So these kids that leave here that have a certificate, that they can leave Glen Rock with a welding certificate. They can leave here and go get a high-paying job because a lot of these kids aren't going to go on to college, and they can leave here with the skills they need to go get a well-paying job at this point. I've got a whole list of stuff here. You know, on the class size, keep talking about that. The studies through K through 3. I have twin 12-year-olds who are in 6th grade now, and I have a 7-year-old who's in 1st grade. So speaking from firsthand experience, the K through 3 small sizes were great. Then when my kids got up to that 4th, 5th, 6th grade and the class sizes got much bigger, there's no study out there that anybody knows of, but I can tell you firsthand, behavior becomes an issue. You start throwing 25 4th graders in a class and expecting a teacher to manage that, that becomes an issue. So I do know for my kids' class size that going from that small K through 3 and then jumped them up for 4, 5, 6, they mature. By 6th grade, they're doing better now, but that 4th, 5, you know, those big classes was a nightmare for teachers. You'd go into parent-teacher conferences and desks are split up, there's seating charts, they're trying to police their classroom. When it was smaller, they didn't have those issues. So that's my 10 cents on the class size. And I guess I can turn it over to Coley for now. If he's got anything to add, I will jump in if I can think of something else. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I guess I just want to, you know, completely agree with the philosophy of the evidence-based model. I loved that first slide where talked about the focus on results and lofty goals and, you know, learning from our external partners around the state. You know, I don't think anybody would argue that Sheridan 2 and Park 1 and Hot Springs, those are really great hot spots of success in our state. We specifically have reached out to them. I know Senator Cost has done a great job helping me personally in Glen Rock. So I would not argue at all about the philosophy of that. I just don't think, you know, the expectation of greatness and exceeding is not something that's not, you know, we're not arguing that in Converse 2. I don't necessarily know how to do it with the cuts that are on the horizon. And I absolutely believe that our teachers deserve the most support. So instructional facilitators and PLC environment, we would not disagree with that. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to do to improve. When we cut from the top, we lost our instructional coaches and our instructional leadership. So there was nobody to grow teachers. There was nobody to provide that classroom support and to grow, and we did see our scores drop. So I just, you know, I support what you guys do, and I know it's a tough job, and I thank you tirelessly. but just wanted you to kind of hear some things. You know, we had 2 years of pretty dramatic cuts, and I think they totaled about the 10%. And we've trimmed the fat. We have really tried to bring kids back, you know, things that we took, but leadership and instructional leadership in this day and age is absolutely critical. So we appreciate your time. Casey, anything else?
Just one more thing I'd like to add, just kind of in general, is I'm 6th generation family in Cumbers County. I've been here all my whole life. I don't plan to go anywhere. There's lots of people like that in Wyoming, and we don't have private schools. Our kids don't have a choice. So, you know, when you're making statewide cuts, just please think of the kids and try to make the cuts as far away from them as you can, because, you know, parents, adults, they can find another job somewhere else. Our kids, for a lack of a better term, are stuck with our school system at this point. We don't have any other options. They have our public school program in Wyoming, and it's been one of the best ones around, I think. And I would hate to see that change. I've lived here my whole life, and I want my kids to live here. I want them to get a job and come back here. I don't want people to be leaving the state of Wyoming because our education system is starting to slip. That's my only piece. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, your mic.
Oh, okay. Janine, you're on. Thank you, Colleen, Casey. Janine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, and thank you all for taking time during this crazy time to talk about this important topic. And this is also my 5th recalibration. I've been with Senator Coe since the beginning, and I too would like to thank him for his dedication to education in the state of Wyoming. But, you know, you heard a little bit about it just a minute ago, but as we go through this, I hope that we think about this in terms of what does this really mean to the future of Wyoming? Our students are Wyoming's future. And it's kind of easy to focus on the dollars and the cents, but sometimes I think we do that and we forget about what the real impact will be on our kids. So let's try and keep that in the forefront. Also, I'd like to say that one thing that really makes me nervous is, and I've had this discussion with Matt Wilmarth, so I'm not speaking out of school, but as we go through the line item detail, it really makes me nervous. And I certainly understand Senator Hicks's concern about, you know, where we sit versus the model and so on and so forth. But please remember that every district is different. We have different community expectations, we have different student demographics, we have different needs, and consequently, there's a need to tweak how we use the resources. For example, in my district, where we have over 40% of our elementary school kids that are ELL, we have to put resources towards ELL funding. So let's look at it as the big picture and the block grant that it is. And hopefully you'll allow us as elected officials to try and make decisions on how those resources really get allocated as we try and meet the needs within our individual communities. And one last thing I wanted to circle back on, because y'all had some discussions about accountability. I served for you on the Accountability Task Force for my 1-year assignment, took over 7 years, so maybe you think I'm kind of ineffective, but I just want you to know that there is indeed a very strong accountability system. Our communities understand and know how each of our schools perform. They get those report cards. Those schools that are not meeting expectations or are below the bar have to supply school improvement plans to the Department of Ed and the State Board for approval. And so there really is attention that's being paid to that. And way back when we were going through this process, Senator Kinski, actually Joel Dvorak was in charge of the group that was trying to run the system of support, which sort of went by the wayside as the Department of Ed took budget cuts. So please rest assured that we all do feel accountable, and we are all trying to do the best for the students that are in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. And if I'm still here, I look forward to working with you on your 6th recalibration. With that, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Charles Oskey and his school board chair, Amy Vineyard. Welcome.
Good morning, co-chairmans and members of the committee. I'm Charles Oskey, Superintendent of Sheridan County School District number 3. I'm going to turn this conversation over to our chairman of our board, Amy Vineyard, at this time.
Good morning, co-chairmans. I'm Amy Vineyard, board chair of Sheridan County School District number 3. First of all, we want to just thank you and everyone on the Recalibration Committee for the opportunity to speak today and what you guys are doing for the schools. It's a hard task that nobody wants to undertake, but the focus for today's testimony is referencing page 18 on the minimum teachers. We feel it is critical to say that with the current law, the legislative model, with small district adjustments, we actually want to see how the evidence-based formula funds small school districts. The small school district adjustment is critical to providing the funding needed for our block grant that is not generated by the funding formula. In previous recalibrations and in a roundabout way, today a statement has been made that it is hard to develop one-size-fits-all formula that generates appropriate funding for schools, small and large. Some examples, the formula creates a 0.2 or a 0.5 FTE when we need 1 FTE. Referencing page 7, talent matters. Talent has a cost. Professional development and salary brings us quality teachers. Talent would apply for teaching jobs in rural schools, or if we pay them according to what the funding model generates. Accountability, basket of goods, and the Hathaway success curriculum sets the requirements for our K-12 master schedules. These requirements expectations are not generated by a formula based on ADM. Theory versus reality when it comes to a K-12 master schedule. Investing in a quality education for all students in Wyoming is critical to the future of Wyoming. We understand the crisis in Wyoming and want to continue to do our part. We are asking that you continue to allow all districts to have a voice and to be involved with the process over the next couple months. We are looking for our cuts, what we've done, we're looking to mothball our rural K-6 elementary school for the school year 21 and 22. And we have reduced staff by 1 certified and 1 classified member. Thank you for your time and consideration and any questions.
Any questions? No, I don't think so. Thanks, Amy.
Thank
Greatly
you
appreciate it.
guys for the opportunity to talk.
Okay, Charles, did you have anything to add?
Sorry, we're playing roller chairs, moving in and out. No, just the opportunity, what was stated by Amy is just we continue to communicate and work through this process. You guys have a huge task in front of you, but you do know we're advocates for K-12 education in the state of Wyoming. So if we can continue to be a part of the process, that would be great.
Thank you. All right, we don't have any other folks for comment at this point, so we'll close public comment. And this is probably a good break point. We'll come back after lunch and pick up on the instructional facilitators if there are more questions from joint education or the recalibration committee members. And we'll just move on from there. So with that, let's go ahead and break for lunch, and we'll be back here at 1 p.m. sharp.